Okay, so this is our first section of 2 on this book of Kierkegaard, Soren Kierkegaard, The Sickness Unto Death. 2 parts for part A and part B. Part B is The Sickness Unto Death is Despair. So we're talking about Kierkegaard and despair. So I'm going to ask the preliminary questions about doing the reading, knew him before and so forth, and then we're going to talk about who wrote this book and a little bit about Kierkegaard himself before we dive into the reading. I assigned the reading to start at the part of actual part 1, which is page 43 in my little Penguin edition. There is also a couple-page introduction and a 1-page preface, which we might also talk about. Don't want to read the sort of translator's front matter, but we could also talk about the preface and introduction. I like diving into the beginning of the first part just because, that is 600 despair part, because it's the part where you sort of instantly getting philosophic and starting you from something, readily understandable that way. My reading of the preface and the introduction is that they make a lot more sense after you've read the book than before it. If by the time you finish the book, you can understand what he's saying in the introduction, then you probably understood the book. But if you think you understood the introduction before you read the book, you probably didn't understand the introduction.
So we're starting with the capital letter A.
Yes.
Which is then subdivided in about 8 levels. And it's despair is the sickness unto death, superscript 1. I have it on page, gosh, my pages.
Your pages start where?
The subsequent page is page 14. So this must be 13 I'm looking at.
Okay. So you're about 30 pages off from where my little edition is, probably because we had a very long-winded translator in my edition.
I have Princeton University Press. That's also the difference.
Okay.
Our page 1 in the book is 43.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, you got it. We're on the same edition. Okay, but before we get to who wrote this book, welcome, Jeff. Glad to have you. Let's go around, and I'm going to ask my usual question, which is, did you manage to do the reading, any or all of it? Had you read this Kierkegaard before or any other Kierkegaard before? Any other sort of class familiarity with him or personal reading familiarity with him? And we'll get immediate takes on it in substance after that. But first, just were you able to do the reading? How far did you get? Anything like that? Have you read it before? Anything like that? So let's start with Craig. I wait until you take your glasses off and then I call on you.
So I did get through the reading. Had a brief introduction to Kierkegaard. We read sections of Kierkegaard when I was in college, but now that's getting close to 50 years ago. So it's kind of buried in the recesses. I did get through this section. Agree with you. The foreword and the front stuff is gibberish until you get pretty far into it. But yeah, so I have some familiarity with Kierkegaard and especially other Christian theologians and their attacks on him. So.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. So do you happen to remember what Kierkegaard you read way back in college days? Was it this one? Was it Fear and Trembling? There's certain things that people usually read, but do you know what it was?
Sections of Fear and Trembling, and few sections of Concluding Postscript.
Okay, yep. For those who don't know, Concluding Postscript is kind of his most philosophical kind of stuff. It's where he's sort of really talking about Hegel things. And Fear and Trembling is his take on the Isaac story out of Genesis. But okay, so Joe.
Just to clear in my own mind, Isaac is when Abraham was going to sacrifice him. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, thank you. I get these things sort of lost. Yes, I launched it and enjoyed very much focusing and reading most carefully, like the last 10 to 15 pages, because the more philosophical it gets, the more interesting it engages me. I don't know if Craig shares my view. He might have been more soft touch, but I was not impressed at all with the first 20 pages, because I felt like I was a young boy back in the old elementary school church level, where the Christian people always had an answer for every goddamn objection I raised. And so if I were to raise objection, well, I don't feel it is despair. What's this thing that try to elucidate to me what it is and why I should feel it? It just goes in a circle, and it ends back up, well, you better love God or not, period. And I didn't like that at all. I'm too modern. I guess I'm too modern for that. But point remains that after he got a little bit deeper, I said, oh, wait a minute. This is much more like the Hegel, because he's really trying to tell you how your mind is working in these ways. He's really not talking about something called despair, which I almost don't even recognize what he's talking about. He's talking about depression. If you're in a deep depression, that's just the modern label we toss on this. I'll have to ask Jason if that's correct.
So I'm gonna derail you, because you're going way off into first reactions, which I do want to get around to. But it's useful to get that first reaction. We'll definitely come back to it. But you got through the reading, hadn't read Kierkegaard before?
Nope.
Okay. Yeah, I will say that there's definitely parts of it which not only can they sound, put it this way, dogmatic and ideological, but you almost wonder, is this the pastor slash physician speaking from a position of supervening authority? And then you have to realize, actually, this is written by a 35-year-old man who had been through some very intense depression himself, and he's reporting from the front lines about his struggles. He's not speaking about it that way. He's talking about the things that happen, but they all happen to him. So it's just a useful thing to realize about this. But fair first reaction. We'll come back to that. It definitely does create a challenge. One thing you can always tell in a book like this is there's some place where you yourself are supposed to fall in his spectrum. He's going to claim that everybody at one time or another is in one level or another of despair. So you have to say, where is he going to diagnose me, right? Where does he put me in this scheme, right?
I acknowledge the kind of person that just doesn't know and doesn't recognize it. So I'm one of those
possibly, right? But recognize yourself when you come across yourself, right? You're going to be in there somewhere, right? Because he's got a pigeonhole for everybody, and maybe more than one for you, but you fit in at least one of them. Okay, Jeff.
Yeah, I just, well, nice to see you guys again. The last time I saw you, you were a red state.
I was what?
The last time I was here, you were a red state, so congratulations. Welcome.
Ah, I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I had some memories of Kierkegaard from college days, and they weren't too good. Started to read. There's around here we've got in San Francisco area. Well, actually not here in Chicago. I've been I never know where I am now because I'm always on Zoom. Chicago has a long-running series of Kierkegaard, and that sort of reminded me why I didn't like it.
Okay, but quick.
Also,
sorry.
I've been most of my devotion has been to Hannah Arendt these days, and something about it seemed like it might say something about that. So I read part one, I read chapter one of part one all the way through, and I might read more depending on how today goes.
Got it. Okay, so some exposure to other bits of Kierkegaard in the past. Don't remember particularly which. What weren't particularly impressed with them then, and you read the first part of the first chapter this time.
I read the first chapter of part one. I got it backwards.
Right. I'm just not quite sure where your chapters end, because
back of the 20 pages that Joe said he couldn't stand.
Got it. Okay, understand. So roughly until.
But don't worry. You don't. I mean, just discuss what you're going to discuss, because I'm
no,
not.
It's fair. Fair enough. Okay.
So
I got it. Maybe to 15 pages. Fair enough. So, Jim.
Yeah, we got I read the whole section.
Mm-hmm.
I've read Kierkegaard before. Ironically, I've read this before, but spent a little bit.
Okay.
Either or, it was hilarious. And to be honest, completely transparent, it's been so long since I read some of this stuff, but my reintroduction was getting a quotable Kierkegaard book because
Okay.
he's got so many good one-liners. So then I was like, I need to look and find out where all these one-liners came from.
Right,
So,
right.
So that's kind of my background with it.
Fair enough. Okay.
Ariel too. Yeah.
Okay. Ariel, did you read this?
I did. I read the first part, loved it. As far as background with Kierkegaard, I don't really have much of a background except for videos and things that he has told me that have stemmed from Kierkegaard.
Got it. Okay, fair enough. All right. So that said, I want to talk a little about who wrote this book, and then we'll jump into first reactions. So after that, we can get into the details of what's really going on in the first part and so on. But first of all, who wrote the book? So obviously, this book was written by Søren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, 1830s to 1840s. He had a short, hard life. He wrote pretty much continuously from his late 20s until his early 40s. Most of his production in his 30s. This book was first written when he was about 35 years old, published when he was 36 or so. He died when he was 42. We don't know of what exactly, but we think he had consumption, tuberculosis, and he probably died of a lung infection. But it might have been pneumonia as a complication rather than tuberculosis itself. But at any rate, he died young at 42. He came from a hard luck kind of family too, because his father's first wife had died before he was born. His mother died when he was 21. His father died when he was 24. Brother and sister died when he was 9. He was the youngest of 7 kids, and by the time he was graduating from college, only him and one brother were still alive. So he had a pretty hard knock life. But he's writing around the same time that where the sort of vogue thing in philosophy is Hegel. Hegel's been around for a while, but he's still, the biggest splash on the scene. He goes to Berlin and studies there with Schelling and some others. But Hegel is sort of the big thing. He's studying philosophy. To him at that time, which he calls the system, was Hegelian philosophy. And there's lots of aspects of what he's doing which are takes on Hegelian philosophy, where he's imbibed a bunch of Hegelian philosophy, and but he thinks that there are things which it's leaving out, or ways in which it's undetermined, in the sense that the kind of reasoning that Hegel engages in, he thinks you could have it come out any way you wanted it to come out, and he'll kind of show that that's the case by ringing changes on Hegelian tropes, so to speak. So there's definitely an indebtedness to Hegel here, but it's also a kind of playful, ironic, or indebtedness, and it can be thought of in large part as a critic of Hegel. He's attacking Hegel for what he thinks left out. Obviously, he's a Christian thinker, almost a theological thinker, although and he did train in all that, but never actually took any vocation. He was on the point of doing so, and just basically being a writer instead. He, as I said, writing lots of books, which were not terribly remunerative. Published in various places in Denmark. Towards the end of his life, his last works, after a bunch of the philosophical stuff, were controversial things attacking kind of the established Lutheran Church in Denmark as being superficial, as being too happy-go-lucky, if I can put it this way, too easygoing, and so in various ways, and fake, kind of fake. So some of his explicitly controversial stuff is all attacking fakeness and shallowness of religiosity around him. You can put it that way. So what kind of tradition are you coming in? So besides the influence of Hegel and the influence of Christianity, he studied Socrates quite a bit. His first work, his doctoral dissertation, was on the concept of irony in Socrates, and through history. he had his early period, which is usually called like his aesthetic period. It's a period where he's mostly focused on literary production, poetry, writing. He's reading the Romantics. And so on. And from his own point of view, he's having a kind of dissolute youth in his 20s. And then he gets into a sort of more serious, both theological and philosophical turn after that. And I'd say that his works become more and more theology focused throughout his 30s. And then by the last 4 or 5 years of his life, it's all the church controversy stuff that he's mostly writing about. So that's sort of the arc of his progression. He went through a period when it was mostly about art and literature, a period where it was mostly about philosophy and theology, and then a period where it's sort of about the controversial established religion sort of questions. Okay, so that's just a little bit of story of the arc of his life. The other thing that's interesting about Kierkegaard is he wrote under pseudonyms a lot, right? There were some things that he wrote in his own name, and those were mostly things which we would consider like edifying Christian works, commentaries on sermons or something like this. But most of his longer form philosophical works were written under pseudonyms of various kinds, and he runs through a whole variety of these. The title of this one is Anti-Climacus. And the Anti-Climacus of the title is he previously had written some of his own works under the pseudonym Climacus. So he's anti himself from 3 years earlier or something. But the Climacus books are the philosophical ones, which are sort of turning Hegel upside down. And it helps to sort of know who he's referring to this title in the first place. So there was an original Climacus who was like a Eastern Orthodox monk who wrote a book about called The Ladder of Divine Ascent or something like this, which was sort of a ascetic practice for monks to reach something like religious purity or enlightenment, right? And that's sort of what Climacus is about, the original Climacus. So when he writes his responses to Hegel under the pseudonym Climacus, he's contrasting what a Greek Orthodox monk of the 7th century considered the ladder of ascent to understanding theology or understanding the deity, with what Hegel considers the ascent of reason in world history. And this contrast is meant to be comical and to Hegel's disadvantage. So the basic idea there is that there may be plenty more history in Hegel's version of it, but it's psychologically much more flip and easygoing. And then his other aspects of his Climacus works will kind of turn some of that upside down in the sense of using Hegelian logic to make things, instead of as easy and reconciled as possible, as difficult and contrary as possible, right? So the same kind of logical thesis, antithesis, synthesis, contrast that you get in Hegel, but used to accentuate differences instead of making them go away, to make stark contrasts instead of reconcile everything. And that's kind of the meaning behind the title Either Or in one of his earlier books, is to make sharp distinctions with choices between them instead of reconciling all opposites into a soup of lukewarm pap from his point of view. Okay, so that's kind of what Climacus was about. So this is Anti-Climacus, and it's not clear, this Anti-Climacus, which Climacus is it anti? It might be that it's anti the Climacus of his own Climacus, right? Or it could be that it's anti the 7th century monk Climacus. It's probably his own Climacus that he's anti. He's pretty much writing about himself. I think it's fair to say that Kierkegaard considers himself far and away the most interesting person in the world, maybe the 3rd most interesting person in the world, but the others being Jesus and Socrates. But anyway, so he's up there, and if he's talking about a Climacus, he's probably talking about his own Climacus, not somebody else's Climacus. Okay, so but this is written by Anti-Climacus, and he doesn't tell you why, right? It's just referring back to his own philosophical productions, but this is going to be making some sort of argument which is very different from the previous argument. And lots of scholars have puzzled over why he would choose that pseudonym for this one. But the main story seems to be something like, here he's using something like Hegelian logic for a more serious constructive purpose instead of just to turn it upside down or play with it, right? He's actually trying to reason about things like what spirit and self are in a constructive sense, and in that sense, he's using Hegelian logic in a way which is not the way he was using it back in his Climacus books. Okay, that's just a little bit of who wrote this darn thing. Okay, and obviously he's got lots of other works. We can talk about those, but we're going to mostly focus on this one and trying to understand it. Last thing I'll just mention before we get into people's first reactions was the front matter. So there's various things you'll get from a translator, not important for us. There's a short preface of like a page, and there's an introduction of 2 pages. And I was saying to some people before Gabriel or Anthony got here, we're going to dive into the part that starts the sickness under death is despair part 1 right away, and skip over those things. But my reason for doing that is not that those parts aren't worth reading, but I think they're way more intelligible after you've read the book than before. It's like this introduction. If you read that introduction, you think you understand it, and you haven't read the book before, you probably didn't understand it. But if after you've read the book, when you read the introduction, you still don't understand it, you probably didn't understand the book. It's one of those cases where you have to read the introduction after the book instead of beforehand. But that's a good test. If you've gotten through the whole book and you go back and read the introduction, it makes more sense to you what he is trying to say there, then you may not agree with him, but you've probably got his points. Okay, so because Anthony and Gabriel managed to join us a little late, I'm going to ask them the same question as we go around. The question people have already answered is, were they able to do the reading? Have they read this Kierkegaard before, or have you read other Kierkegaard before? So short answers to that we've already done. But I also just want to get first impressions to the book. We already got some of that from Joe, but Joe, do you want to add anything to what you had previously said about your first impressions? You're still on mute, Joe. And you're still on mute. Not yet. Now you go. Okay.
I ended up not only failing to unmute, but I also went blank. I was pretty voluble earlier, I guess, to get this other recording. After we get
that was already on the recording. Don't worry about that. It's already there. Yeah.
Okay. First impression is that he is talking about himself. He's a troubled person. He's being very introspective, and that's when it finally got to conclude to me that he's doing an interior of the mind thing, much like Husserl was doing. Husserl was doing it, as a procedure to explore, and Kierkegaard's doing it as an experience, and then he's classifying, like Aristotle did, experiences and observations, which is nice. And I like how taxonic he was in the beginning. I found myself on page 68, I think, but I have to go back and read page 66, 7, and 9 to make sure. First impressions. If he keeps going in this newly involved direction and stays away from too much of the God stuff, I'll stay with him.
He's going to go deep into the God stuff. Sorry.
Oh, well, I guess I should find out what it was all about by,
Yes, the formula that might help a little bit with that, just to, it may eventually form a block, no question, but there's a term he uses one place, the power that established it. We're talking about the self.
I caught that.
And if you put that in as your formula for the thing he's expecting you to have a reaction to, then it may help a little bit. But we'll also get into what this whole self business is at all, right? And that may also help a little bit with it. But yes, it's fair to say it's a very interior thing. It's not nearly as sort of scientific, clinical as you get in Husserl, where he's trying to describe sort of how the machinery perception works.
This is 100 years. That's your 100 years of gap there between the way people talk about things. 60,
70, yeah, but fair. But it's not just that. There's also a definite difference in temperament. He's talking about the put it this way, the ethical or spiritual content of the inward life, not about how the inside is connected to the outside. right? If I wanted to contrast him with Husserl. Okay, Gabriel, I assume you know the questions.
Okay, so I have read Kierkegaard before. I've read this book before, but not with as much attention as I did this time. So it was definitely more enriching going through, really trying to understand it this time. I think I've also read The Concept of Anxiety, and I own Works of Love, which I love. So it's a bit of a different kind of book, but it still has his great rhetorical style throughout. So this one, I loved the part that we read. I love like his psychological acuteness. I particularly enjoyed sort of the last little chapter where he focuses on, and I have a slightly different translation than the one you recommended. I think I have the Hong translation, but in despair to will to be oneself, defiance, he talks about that in the last chapter. So I really enjoyed that because, I mean, to me, I know other people have different perspectives, but to me, the whole idea of, you know, like, don't be part of the crowd, like be conscious of yourself, that basic existential motif is like very thoroughly assimilated. Like I don't sort of like stumble on that. But I think that when people pursue, you know, they switch on to that and they're sort of like, you know, let's be an individual, let's be authentic, then they can kind of easily fall into that despair to will to be oneself. And so kind of a question, as I read this book, is sort of like, maybe how have other existentialists who maybe don't have God in the picture fallen into this trap? Because I found it brilliant what he said. And I know you like Stoicism too, and I know he calls this kind of despair Stoicism. So it would be interesting.
There's two different things going on here, right? So the Stoicism is the one right before that, right? The despair of not wanting to be oneself, the despair of weakness, right? There's a prideful version of that, but which isn't yet the sort of resentful wanting to be yourself. And that's the one that he equates. Exactly. The one that isn't the resentful one is the one he equates to Stoicism, right?
Yes.
It wants to be a self-mastery. It wants to be the author of oneself, right?
Yes.
And it's the one after that where the wanting in despair to be yourself, which is the sort of resentment one. It's the I'm suffering like hell, and I want to go on suffering like hell just to prove that the world sucks, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
And it's interesting. It's interesting how he links them too, and maybe it's debatable how linked they are, but he sees that first more stoic stage as being something that would naturally lead on to what he calls the demonic despair, as long as you have you know, something that's deeply wounded you or something. I mean, the last couple of pages in what we read really reminds me of something like Dostoevsky or something like Ivan Karamazov. So, you know, it's really brilliant. I also find it interesting how he says, you know, this figure of the person of demonic despair is really like noticed in real life. You tend to see him in like literary productions. So
it's an artistic purity of it. So you're jumping ahead to the very end of the reading though to give me your first reaction. I get it, but
okay, I'll go back to the start though. I'll go back to the start because the start is one that I stumbled on.
Great. We'll get to the start, but I think it's fair to say that the pictures drawn of the different forms of despair is sort of the psychologically acute aspect of all this, and it's the part which is sort of most attractive to the professional or amateur psychologists in us. I know that you're training to be a psychologist, right? So knowing the different kinds of ways in which people can have a different version of resentment, depression, pride, complex of various kinds, right? This is, you know, well before a Freud or a Jung, and it's much the same kind of psychological acuteness. And you're right, the other place you find it is in the great novelists, especially the Russians. All very fair. That sort of psychological acuteness is impressive in him. Some of the earlier forms of despair he goes over, it's more viewed from the outside, and it's more it's the farce before the tragedy, so to speak. And we'll talk about that contrast in these various dialectical stages as we get along to it. But I just want to be clear here: when he's diagnosing these different forms of despair, he's not necessarily saying that things move in the same way he's laying them out in the writing as a progression. From his point of view, people get stuck in every one of these stages, right? And it's not necessarily the case that one of them, moves on to the next one right after it. We'll come to his diagnosis of the Stoic version of despair, the self-authoring version of despair, so to speak, which is in a way quite different from the resentment one. And he doesn't think that one necessarily progresses to the other. But he will say that there's something a little bit, there's always something of, from his point of view, something of a element of defiance in every conscious form of despair. That's the thing that might link them. But he has very different criticisms of the two, as well as different diagnoses of what's causing them. But we'll get to those nice subtle distinctions toward the end. I think you're right, though, that the poignancy of the psychological vignettes you get towards the end of this section are sort of more impressive than the earlier ones. The earlier ones are like trying to establish a bunch of things. They're trying to go through a lot of, in a way, more superficial cases that are, they might be closer to common sense, but it's also harder to swallow because he's taking something trivial in every day and he's diagnosing it with this, machinery the size of a house, right? Anyway, good on first impressions. I want to ask a little bit about the, you said works of love, and what was the other one you said you read?
Concept of Anxiety.
Concept of Anxiety. So have you read Fear and Trembling?
Yeah, I've read it, but like as a teenager, so
Got
I don't
it, okay.
remember too much of it. Just remember a lot of angst.
Yes. What about either or any of his controversial things about the present age or the attack upon Christendom or any of that kind of stuff?
No, I really like to read either or, but I haven't yet.
Okay. The other one I know you would like, just because of the kind of things I know you like, would be this one. You'd like this one.
Purity of Heart. Okay.
Yeah. But that's the one that I would call, in kind of the same tradition that you would get of, what am I thinking of? Something like Dark Night of the Soul or something like that. But I mean, it's more of a meant to be a practical aesthetic kind of thing. Okay, but fine. And I assign this one because I think it's like his most philosophical of his major works. I mean, there's things in concluding postscripts that are all about Hegel that are in a way more philosophical, but they're not really his. They're just sort of commenting on somebody else's philosophy. But this one is, if Fear and Trembling is his most aggressively theological work, this one is his most sort of not even scientific, philosophical and psychological work.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, so sorry, everybody keeps moving around, so I don't know what order to call on people. Let's go with Craig next. First impressions.
First impressions were getting lost a little bit in section A. There seemed to be, as much as he was trying to build a synthesis, he seemed to be circular at times. And so I was tending to get lost in section A.
I want to just stop you right there and say absolutely fair. If there's logic here, it's Hegelian logic, which means it's a paradox and a contradiction, preferably in the same sentence and always on the same page, right? So there is a certain clarity in it, but sometimes the logical changes he's bringing through are just the occasion for sparking off the series of thoughts that you'll think about it afterwards. It's almost like he's just rotating around a wheel and then he's going to go off and tell you it just made him think of something, right? There's even a part in there where he says health is the ability to swallow contradictions, to overcome contradictions. And this is his Hegelian training, and it's also his love of paradox and his love of the absurd. But a logically clear thinker, no one has ever accused him of being. Not really even trying to be. He's trying to be literary, inventive, psychologically acute, something like that, but not logical deductive. And that's characteristic of his work throughout. There's a kind of anti-intellectualism of that kind throughout. It's characteristic of his dismissal of the system as a Hegelian philosophy. It's characteristic of his, the thing he loves most about Socrates is his irony, right? And the fact that he's, always showing up other people as being caught in contradictions they don't recognize, because Socrates thinks that the average person is of course completely enmeshed in a whole web of contradictions of which he's completely unaware. That's sort of the ordinary state of the human mind, to Kierkegaard's Socrates, if not Socrates himself. But yeah, so if you want logical clarity, he's the farthest thing from it. And there's lots of philosophers that can't stand that. It just drives them nuts. By the way, it drives them nuts in Hegel too, because Hegel is also capable of the same kind of thing of he'll ring all these changes on a certain set of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. When he gets to the synthesis part, you're like, where did that come from? Right? It's like a king flying out of nowhere as the thing which is putting these things together. And there's a certain seeming arbitrariness to it. But there's usually some sense in what he picks out, and he'll have some acute insights about it. But it's fair to say that each of these sort of spinning from A to not A to what is neither A nor not A always winds up being able to be pointed in some new direction on that third step. And the new direction is always being put in there kind of surreptitiously by the author and his interests and where he wants to go, and not from the preceding, right? It's not a chain of deduction. That style in logic, or in logic and philosophy in particular, goes back to Fichte in his Science of Knowledge. And there's definitely debts in the stuff we'll start on to that. But you're absolutely right that logically clear he is not. Sorry, do you have other parts of your action?
So that kind of led into a sense that he was almost toying with Hegel, and started to rip him a little bit here, rip a little bit there, and by the third section he was almost downright critical of him, which I found fascinating. But what struck me in terms of straight reaction as I got into the third section is, this is the Christianity I grew up with that I rejected. I suddenly saw the despair of both of my parents in the way they lived their lives in a whole different light by reading this. Even remembering one time in high school at the dinner table, I made the comment that in Latin class we just started reading about Stoics, and I decided that our family was more Stoic than it was Christian, and that ended dinner and got sent to my room for even making such a suggestion. But I hit a real nerve with that. So the sense of despair that he talks about, hidden between the comfort of Christendom, as I think he said it at one point, is exactly what I grew up with, and exactly what it was shallow, it was superficial. I just couldn't live with it, and so it really resonated at that point when he started into that. So I'm looking forward to seeing what he does with the next step.
Yeah, and I would say that that's a characteristic Kierkegaardian reaction to the kind of flip religiosity of his day, so to speak. And this is in his last controversial works, his Attack Upon Christendom, or The Present Age, right? That's what you get all of, right? I mean, it's he's almost saying, there's this absurd pretense that Europe is Christian, right? I don't see any Christians around me, right? And the partly this is a reaction to Hegel still, because Hegel is presenting this, this big tower of rationalist abstractions as showing how world history culminates in, the constitutional monarchy, parliamentary state of Prussia, with Lutheran Christianity as its established church that has reconciled all contradictions and revealed the essence of God on earth, right? And this is what you get in Hegel. And Kierkegaard looks at that and he sees, the level of religion in this would fit in a thimble, right? It's like the most superficial reading of what religiosity is he can imagine, and he looks around and he sees that that's exactly this kind of sort of shallow surface religiosity is the only religiosity he sees. But he's not reacting to that by dismissing religiosity as a result. He's reacting to that with this kind of hunger for an older, deeper aesthetic, more monastic, or more mystical inward religiosity that he doesn't see in any of the establishment around him. And his way of bringing that out is just to heighten this contrast with, if Hegel is rationalism, I don't want any of it. Right? That's his basic attitude. So
yeah, the other one he started reminding me of was Bonhoeffer and Cost of Discipleship, where he talked about cheap grace. I felt like Bonhoeffer was almost the 20th century commentary that was very similar to what Kierkegaard's leading into.
Yeah, and I would say this was immensely influential for later modern theology, right? And for existentialism generally, this authenticity thing, this in the rest of existentialism, and also this. It's almost, if it's not deep, tortured, and inward, it doesn't count, right? It's sort of something like that. And there are elements of that which can be destructive in their own way, and we may get to that, but. That's definitely the original impression. It's all the religion he sees around him is shallow and fake. That's the fundamental starting point here.
Yeah.
Okay. By the way, including some of his own. Okay. So it's not just a condemnation of others. Okay. Still trying to do first reactions. Anthony, you also get to answer. Did you read the reading? Have you read Kierkegaard before? This or any others? And then first reactions.
I've read, I don't know if it's a good amount of, I've read Kierkegaard's Philosophical Fragments. I think I've read either or. I definitely read The Crowd is Untruth.
Good essay.
Fear and Trembling. Yeah, yep. Crowd is Untruth. I think it reminds me of Rene Girard's scapegoating mechanism a bit. Fear and Trembling is probably one of my favorites because Abraham and the analogy that he gives there with the 3 levels, which corresponds a little bit to me to 3 degrees of masonry. Which you guys know, and the concept of anxiety. And yep. I've read the one we're discussing right now, The Sickness Unto Death.
Yep.
And primarily because that's what got me interested deeply in existential Christianity. I feel like he was the first person that I ever heard attempt to do anything with psychology and Christianity. And before I came across him, psychology was like of the devil. And I was like, it's like we, like the Christian circle seemingly cede more and more ground to the devil until basically all domains are basically satanic. I'm like, well, so I don't know, but he recovered that for me, and then I was like, well, maybe we've just been being lazy in regards to psychology within Christian circles. I like, I didn't reacquaint myself with it just recently. I just got invited to this and I've been busy, but I know of it. The things that stood out to me, and I want to throw this out at you guys to see, what you think and stuff like that. But I like the tension between the eternal, external, temporal, in eternal, because I guess the way I think of that is that who you really are is the tension of those things themselves, and your actual experience is the tension that you have between the temporal and eternal. And sometimes people over-identify with either of those, and I think that's where the despair comes. And I like the golden mean type of perspective with that tension is kind of like the way that I try to approach it. And so I don't know if that's what other people come away from it thinking, but that's kind of like where I come out of it thinking it as. So
that's a good thought. Well, we'll definitely get into that when we talk about what he means by spirit and having a self and what a self is and all that kind of stuff, because some of this is like a very abstract philosophical formula, but he's really trying to talk also about something which is sort of the baseline of his psychology, and it's all around those exact categories and those exact tensions. So there's a kind of philosophical base for a fundamentally psychological or inward spiritual understanding, and what is a self, right? And it's a concept which he kind of establishes here. It has philosophical precursors, but he takes it in a kind of a new direction. And that notion of what a self is has a significant history after him that's indebted to him. I'm thinking of in people like Jung in particular, but definitely in others, in maybe Miguel Unamo. You get a little bit in Gasset, some of the other early existentialists. Okay, good first reactions. Jim, we've made you wait all this time for your first reactions.
Well, it was reminded me a lot of how when I read Sartre a long time ago, and now it makes sense why. I was first, I wouldn't say I read it well, because the first time I read it, had.
Oh, you lost your mic.
Oh,
Mic went out.
How about now?
That's better.
How's that?
Maybe that's better.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I first encountered it a couple years ago. I had a meeting with Gabriel and Anthony, and just talking about life and things like that. And they mentioned the Dark Night of the Soul, and they mentioned a couple other things, Kierkegaardian. And I kind of want a little bit of a Kierkegaard thing there. Either or was hilarious, but my reactions to this, besides the fact that it reminded me of how I felt when I read Sartre, also maybe mentioning what Gabriel said, is now I get to read this kind of thing from a Christian perspective. So God becomes the thing that I guess what Sartre would say is doesn't exist. So just accept the absurd, you idiot, and get on with it. So I also had a lot of questions about his connections to Heidegger, because I was reading, especially in section A, I'm like, oh my God, Heidegger. And I wanted to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting that because I've been so saturated in Heidegger.
Yeah.
But I thought, wow, that's fascinating. And I'm trying to, and I won't get into detail about that because the questions will take us 10 weeks, but to whatever extent you want to get into them later.
No, it's fair to say a lot. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, and then the last part was I would definitely, Ari and I, we've kind of worked on this together, and she's like, "You thought you're the reserved despair, Pa." I was like, "Yeah, I think that's probably pretty accurate." So I definitely fall nicely in one of those pigeonholes. Like, oh my God, it's me.
Okay, so you've been diagnosed.
So
there
that
you
was
go.
interesting.
There you go.
Yeah.
So on the influence side, I mean, it's fair to say a lot of this sort of both the inward spirituality kind of stuff did have an afterlife in the rest of existentialism, including atheistic existentialism. You definitely find that in Sartre. You're right that it definitely influenced being in time, especially some of the stuff about when he gets beyond the care stuff to conscience stuff in being in time. Another one who is, sort of influenced in the same direction would be Camus, who, a lot of similarity with Sartre, but he's more explicitly on the Christian side, although in an absurdist version of that, similar to Kierkegaard. But Camus is another one of the existentialists, definitely in the Kierkegaardian vein. There are some other people surprisingly influenced by him that people know less about. There's a mystic side of Wittgenstein, for example, even though he's mostly all about the logic stuff. And Wittgenstein famously said that he thought that Kierkegaard was the most profound thinker of the 19th century, which is, considering the century he's in, a pretty astounding thing for a logical positivist to say. But anyway, that's just definitely influences and impressions and so forth. Another thing I'll say is that both the psychology angle and there's a way in which later existentialism has this focus on the bleak, if I can put it that way. There's whether it's the nothing or Sartre's nausea or Heidegger's care or absurd tensions and futility in Camus, right? That go back to this whole emphasis on despair or overcoming despair in Kierkegaard. And you sometimes wonder if they kept all the negative parts and threw away the supposed reconciliation that's there in Kierkegaard. But some things were possible in the 19th century that weren't possible in the early 20th, apparently. Okay, but good first reactions. Ariel, do you want to give us first reactions?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So first off and foremost, this, in my opinion, is the greatest book I've ever read and is now my new favorite. I absolutely love it. The cool thing I noticed is that what you touched on, his way of kind of like, oh, I'm wrapping around this reel and that makes me go this way, and then I'll tie it back. It's interesting because that's kind of how I think, and when I talk, I can be very, small spaghetti. So it was interesting to see that. I really liked how in the first part, he gives the groundwork, he lays out what the self is and everything. And I thought that was very cool, the how he made the distinction of what the self is and how that very much contrasts from what we, not we, but how most people think what the self is. Mostly it's viewed as a very surface level type self, your wants, desires, those type of thing. So it was cool to see how he took it deeper, and he said, no, that's just the surface level. What is the self is what's behind that, operating that, and also the relation to that. I thought that was very, very interesting, very profound. I also like how the other part of the first part, the second part, how it was kind of, like you were saying, almost like psychological profiling, almost like that of in criminal psychology, where you figure out, okay, what do these people fall in the category of, and then you figure out, oh, that's me. Yep.
Right.
So I like that as well. I like that a lot. The self in the body and how it relates, it kind of just made me personally, it to me spoke to me in the sense of, oh, that perhaps is another indicator of the Imago Dei, just as Father, Son, Holy Spirit. We have our own Trinity, so to speak, of body, self, soul, and spirit, and that's which observes the relation of those things with each other. So I thought that was very interesting.
Well, you'll get a different one in Freud too. You'll have your ego, superego, and id, and so forth. And this
Yes.
way of psychologically mapping those things out has a later history for sure. I've even heard someone who compared those three in Freud to the legislative, executive, and judicial powers in the U.S. Constitution. But anyway, there's plenty of people that have fun with what they can do with those triune mapping, so to speak. Okay, so Jeff, I know you got like 15 or 20 pages in. You already told us a little bit about your first reactions, but anything more on your first reactions before we get into the details of it?
Yeah, I guess that's the thing that should have been included here was my relating of it to Arendt.
To Hannah Arendt, yeah, okay.
The way it was the way that the concepts I'm trying to sort of tease out of Arendt is aspiration. I'm seeing her sort of coming from Nietzsche in a way. So anyway, I think this sort of fits into that mode of thinking. So that's why I feel like I'm not straying too far from my main priority by being here. Otherwise, I'm going to generally be kind of quiet because you've got some good collection of scholars here today, and people have read a lot of Kierkegaard. And it's the other thing is that I want to second that I remember now why I was interested and still am somewhat interested in Kierkegaard. It is a psychological insight. It's just amazing that.
Yep.
So back.
I just want to talk a little bit.
I'm studying Kant now, and I'm seeing Kant as maybe actually laid out the whole roadmap for modern thinking, I think. So, but then again, you're saying that Kierkegaard comes from Hegel, who obviously was reacting to Kant. So they
definitely tie together. If you want to know some of the ways in which those things string together and might lead up to Arendt, one book I can recommend is there's a book called From Hegel to Nietzsche by Karl Lowith, who was a student of Heidegger, and co-student with Arendt. Karl Lowith, Lowith. Let's see if I can find it somewhere here. Not sure if I can, but it's just called From Hegel to Nietzsche, and it just talks about the the sort of other 19th century thinkers that stand between those two, and it includes sections on Kierkegaard, sections on Marx, and others along the way. But it's, I think, especially if you're wanting to know how any of this might wind up relating to Arendt's concerns, that would be a very good way of tying them together. The other thing I'll say that is the thing in Arendt that sort of a common theme here is her focus on action and on the possibilities of action, which she partly gets from Heidegger, but that has a more inward and spiritual sense in Kierkegaard than it has for Arendt, with a sort of more outward political and historical action focus. But it's the same.
Right.
It's the same.
I'm doing the human condition in
Yeah.
multiple groups.
Yeah. I'm just saying that there's the same focus on in them on there's some sense in which human being is an acting steward of their life, which is crafting the future they drive into, so something like that. And that's the meaningful sense of action in Arendt, and it's also the sense of kind of agency of inward action that you find in Kierkegaard. Again, in different directions. In the case of Arendt, it's more focused on historical political action in a kind of more Hegelian vein, if you like. But there's that same action focus. Anyway, that's just some thoughts about ways to might tie some of this together with Arendt that might be useful to you. Okay, so with that said, we want to jump into the actual text itself, and he starts off with this. He first tells us that despair is a sickness of spirit of the self, and he tells us, there's different forms of it, and he's going to go through all the forms. But before that, he just starts with these ringing sentences. The human being is spirit. What is spirit? Spirit is the self. What is the self? The self is a relation which relates to itself, or that in the relation which is its relating to itself. What? Proper reaction is what, right? Craig's point of how logical is this? We need to understand what he means by this self business, right? And this is the kind of thing that if you're trained on enough Fichte and Hegel, you kind of know why he's saying all this stuff. And if you're not, you have no idea where the heck this is coming from, right? It seems very abstract, but this is, to German idealism, a well-trodden ground, so to speak. He does have his own take on it. He's saying his own things about it, but self as the thing which can be conscious of itself, the human being as a synthesis of finite and infinite, of the temporal and the eternal, and of freedom and necessity, in short, a synthesis, all of that is things you could have found in Hegel, right? But let's talk about what he means by a self. So the first thing to understand about a self is that a self is bigger than a self now, right? That's why the finite and the eternal is part of this synthesis, right? So the first thing to think about this is, imagine you have, when he says it's a relation of something to itself. So you have to start off with an ARA, right? We've got one thing on one side of the relation, some abstract R for the relation, and the same thing on the other side of the relation instead of something different. An ordinary relation is ARB. This one is an ARA. It's something related to itself, right? Normally, a relation of something to itself is an equal sign. A is equal to A, right? That's identity. So first thing to notice is identity, whether or not your future self and your present self are the same, and self are correlate concepts. And this little formalism is telling us something about that. So when we always talk about self and identity, and we think it makes perfect sense. So of course, we're talking about our sense of identity. But what do we mean by a sense of identity? We mean that there's something about ourselves which is the same across our whole lives. That's what we mean by our identity, right? There's some unity that puts together the whole history of our life. And so the self is this notion of the bigger than now in time aspect of ourselves. We are not momentary creatures. We are through long stretches of time creatures, which maybe transform, but the self is not us in any of those stages of transformation. It's the thing that's doing the transforming, right? The self is this whole of us through all of our life. Okay. The next thing there is he calls this a synthesis of the temporal and the eternal. Why? Well, if you're talking about a little time series of facts, right? You have, the fact at time 1 and the fact at time 2 and the fact at time 3, and you have to put all of them together to get all of those times in the time series. But that time series itself no longer has a time in it. It's outside time. So in that sense, you've got a self that has a history, right? But if the history is all of these states rolled together like a movie in all of its frames, that whole set of things exists outside time. It's a mathematical object outside of time of the whole history. So that's the first thing that he means by this synthesis of the temporal and the eternal. There's some unfolding involved in it, yes, to get it there. Once it's all unfolded, you've got this whole history stretched out in time. It's a spatially extended thing. And that spatially extended thing, since it now has a slice for every point of its time, has stopped changing and is no longer affected by the category of time. In that sense, it's as eternal as a piece of mathematics. Kierkegaard's understanding of the self is that we ourselves are making our own personal version of such a thing. In our lives, we are constructing an eternal object that will be there forever. One moment at a time, we're deciding where our life goes. In the course of doing that, we're navigating some branching, whatever, temporal space, creating some story of the pattern of our lives. When we're done, there will be a how we lived, our whole life, our life movie, right? It will be done, complete, and finished. And at that point, it's an eternal object. So he's calling having a self a synthesis of the finite and the infinite, and a synthesis of the temporal and the eternal, because we are in time making something that will exist forever, right? The story of our life, the history we left behind, right? So that's the self we are constructing. And the formula for this as relating to itself, that's what the identity thing is. We have ourself now, we have ourself 5 minutes in the future. We have an identity relationship between them. Okay, we're steering from one to another. What's the steering part of that? The steering part of that is, do you want to be yourself? Do you want to be the self you were 5 minutes ago? What self are you going to be 5 minutes from now? Right? So the sense in which you are navigating, constructing what you are in the future, what you were in the past, the way in which your past informs your future, right? All of this is part of this process that you are responsible for, that is constructing the you, right? You're an unfinished identity. You're an unfinished self. And it's going to come out here, or it's going to come out there, and then it's going to be finished. And you are responsible for constructing it. That's what it is to have a self. Okay, so the first point is, even just considered aesthetically, right? You get to, and whether you want to or not, you will sculpt an eternal object. Here's the first question an aesthetic person asks themselves about that. Am I going to make an ugly, botched thing or something beautiful? Because I'm going to make an eternal object one way or the other. There's a chain of ascent in the earlier works in Kierkegaard of the aesthetic perspective, the ethical perspective, and the religious perspective. And I want to explain how those three things tacked on top of each other fit into this understanding of what self is. You may start off trying to just make something beautiful, and then you decide, well, actually, I'd rather be something beautiful than make something beautiful. Then you decide that the most beautiful thing is ethical action. It's the only thing that really impresses you. So you want to understand ethical action. Now you want to try to be ethical. And then from his point of view, the religious begins when you realize that you're failing at it miserably. You have a standard of ethical action that you're trying to conform with as you try to construct a beautiful life. and you know you are failing against your own standard. And for him, the religious begins with the humility about that failure. Joe.
Okay, isn't the issue there, however, really that whatever standard he's trying to follow is absurdly impossible to follow? And so
Yes.
it seems to me that, and I'm not sure if he's getting his standard out from Kant or Christianity or whatever, but it seems to me that since he's adopted an impossible goal, I cannot see how he would ever reach it.
Yes, and he will agree with you. He does not see how he could ever reach it. But the hope that you can reach what you cannot see how you could possibly reach is what he means by faith. We can come back to that in a minute. But you're right. There's a question of where does the standard come from, right? And you're right that to some degree it comes to him from outside. It comes to him from some cases it's a literary thing. In some cases it's Socrates as the man of science. In some cases it's the Knight of Resignation and these other characters that occur in his literary works. But the elephant in the room is it's Jesus that he's trying to emulate, or that is setting a standard for him that he's trying to measure up to. But you're right to ask, where does the standard come from, and is the standard attainable? He's much more interested in the first question than the second. But from his point of view, the psychology doesn't depend upon that. From his point of view, you can give the standard to yourself, and you'll have the same self with the same navigation problem. And most of the people along his way do. They invent a standard for themselves and apply it, and the form of despair in which they find themselves correlates to how they've done that and how botched the job is. He gives there's a wonderful section where he's describing the problem with Hegel. I think it's on, what is it, page 73 or something, where yes, page 74. Hegel builds this great philosophical system, right? A thinker erects a huge building, a system, one that encompasses the whole life and world history, and then one turns in astonishment to his personal life, and one discovers that the appalling and ludicrous fact that he himself does not live in this huge high-vaulted palace, but in a storehouse next door, or in a kennel, or at most the janitor's quarters. If one took it upon oneself to draw attention with but a single word to this contradiction, he would be insulted. For so long as he can complete the system with the help of his error, being an error is not what he is afraid of. So he gives the point about, people have this beautifully put together house and they live in the basement, right? But that's his version of the standards people apply to themselves. People give themselves these standards and then they go for the lowest one, right? They go for the easiest one. And that's, that's to him, the various forms of giving up. Why is all this despair? Despair is to give up about reaching a standard of making something important out of your life, right? And you're right that you could say, where would the standard come from that tells me what I should make out of my life? Well, you could do it yourself, or you might find it somewhere else. But if you don't, you're just not having one, right? That's a way of giving up, right? If you decide that I'm going to get it from somewhere else, and this is the one I want to choose because it's one I can easily attain, okay? That's another way of giving up. It's just lowering your sights. You might have first had an idea of some grand ambition that you might be able to accomplish as the story of your life, but it looked a little bit hard, so you settled for just not being tortured to death, right? And you keep your head down and just try to make sure that you don't get tortured to death, and that's your standard of a successful life, right? So that's exactly what he's talking about, right? His different forms of despair, the different ways in which people give up on the task of living their life in a meaningful way, right? In a way that they themselves would take seriously, right? And that's the element of this sort of inward existential aspect to it that is very attractive to later existentialists. He's perfectly happy if that standard is something you gave yourself. Well, we'll get to the second part of the book where he might not be quite so happy with it. But initially, right, it is just an observation of the fact of the case that everyone is giving the standard to themselves. And then the only question is, does it work or do they get stuck? And the physician in him, the clinical psychologist in him, the Christian pastor in him is just finding all the ways people get stuck. But the task they're getting stuck at is making something meaningful out of their life. And to him, that's what it means to have a self, is to realize that you're trying to do something serious with your life. Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Yes. Finally, I get this idea now, and I actually like how he has developed it. Well, I like how he's concluded it. I know that when I developed my own standard, 30 years ago, about a day later or same day, I was in a parking lot and I just opened a chewing gum, and I was just proceeding to throw something onto the parking lot, and yes. I thought to myself, wait a minute, Joe. And I put it in my pocket and took it home. Yes. And it now almost becomes incomprehensible when I have similar situations. There's hundreds of them every day. Am I going to do what my own values tell me I would want anybody else to do?
Yes.
In my presence? And the answer, it just becomes an impossible thing. But I could appreciate that if somebody else had been told, you must do this. This is the standard. This is everything external. Nobody's going to follow that. Everybody shrugs on the purpose sometimes just to show they can. Heaven's sake.
So partly true, but part of the kinds of despair that he's diagnosing first, the unconscious parts early on, are precisely about people who avoid the difficulty of this problem by outsourcing it to their society and everyone else around them, and then just doing whatever fits in well with their time and place, right? They just do the conventional thing, and they just focus.
And they are always short of the standard, so they can always look and say, "Well, oh heavens, I'm guilty."
No, his point is that they start with a very simple, reachable, common sense standard. They measure themselves by their neighbor, but they only want to measure up to where their neighbor is, and in very conventional things, and especially in worldly things. And Kierkegaard's attitude towards that is, of course, that's what most people do, but he then gives you a definition of the worldly in a little epigram. The worldly is being overly concerned with things which are irrelevant, things which are indifferent. That's what worldliness is, right? So if the aims of your life are all things that you yourself know in your heart are completely irrelevant, are completely unimportant, then you're basically treating your own life as unimportant, right? Which in a sense you're free to do, but there's a result, right? The result is you don't do anything serious, you don't take yourself terribly seriously either. The other point that he makes along the way is that people in those shallower forms of what they try to do with their life, where they don't even think they have a self, he calls this not conscious of having a self at all, right? Is some knock will come along, and then they'll realize that they were in despair their whole life. What's the point? When the knock comes along, when things don't go their way, they're undone. There's no serious purpose there. There's no dedication there. There's no strength of character there. They're only held together by the fact that they're respected by their neighbors and that they, aren't in immediate want, right? Let a foreign power invade your country and, tyrannize half the people and, disease, strike half your family down, right? How well do you cope with your superficial concerns then? Does your life still have a meaning, or has it been completely blown to atoms, right? And his answer is, if tragedy like that strikes most of those people, it's going to blow them to atoms, right? Maybe as a result they deepen what they're trying to do with their life, but more often they're just in despair over it. They don't know what to do, right? They only had shallow things to hang on to, and if the shallow things are taken away, they're lost, right? So that's the diagnosis of the early types of despair. The people that are dedicating their lives to worldly, superficial, external, conventional things, right, get along fine with little noise or perturbation as long as the world is incredibly stable around them. But it's not because they're stable, it's because their world is stable. And that can disappear in an instant. and often does. As he knows well, since he was one of 7 kids and 3 parents, one of only 2 still surviving by the time he was 33. Okay, so anyway, that's the first thing about what the heck this self is. And there's this very terse Hegelian formula for what it is, behind which there's this giant, idea of this synthesis of freedom, necessity, finite and infinite, and temporal and eternal. The giant idea behind that is that as we live our life, we are constructing the eternal object of our trajectory, something like that. Gabriel.
So I'm wondering, how does that fit with his Christian belief in eternal life? It seems a bit out of place, that idea that you're constructing this self that's going to end and are going to exist as like a sculpture in eternity. That doesn't seem like what he's getting at a bit later on, especially when he emphasizes, possibility, the saving power of possibility and always having possibility. So how does that work together for you?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a fair question. You're right that he says that the person in despair, possibility is what he needs, like breath, right? The future possibility, change, etc. But especially in some of the bleaker parts, some of the bleaker early parts here, I think especially the stuff at the end of section B, he's just entirely forthright about it, right? There's such a thing as just running out of time to change any of it. When the hourglass is run out, the hourglass of temporality, when the worldly tumult is silenced and the restless or unavailing urgency comes to an end, when all about you it is as still as eternity, whether you are a man or a woman, rich or poor, dependent or free, happy or unhappy, whether you bore with your elevation the splendor of the crown, or in humble security only the toil and heat of the day, whether your name will be remembered as long as the world lasts, or you'll only be remembered as long as it lasted, or you are without name and run nameless with the numberless multitude, whether the glory you surround yourself surpassed all human description, or the severest, most ignominious human judgment was passed upon you. Eternity asks you, and every one of these millions of millions, just one thing: whether you have lived in despair or not. Whether so in despair that you did not know that you were in despair, or in such a way that you bore the sickness concealed deep inside you as your gnawing secret, under your heart like the fruit of a sinful love, or in such a way that, a terror to others, you raged in despair. If you have lived in despair, then whatever else you want are lost. For you, everything is lost. Eternity does not acknowledge you. It never knew you. Or still more dreadful, it knows you as you are known. It manacles you to yourself in despair. Right. He's not saying that so, after you die, you get to repent in purgatory there at all.
No, but he is. You could interpret that quite easily in the sense of like the Christian notion of heaven and hell. In that case, he would just be saying that the way you've lived has condemned you to hell. And if you're not in despair, or at least you died not in despair, then that is heaven. That seems to be what he's saying. But then your self continues. Or it becomes something else that's not a self, I suppose. But it sounds like when I'm reading him that, it continues with more possibility and,
Perhaps if you like, but there is a moment that is checked for despair, so to speak, right? And construction after that point is unavailing, if you like.
Yeah, right. But he also talks about how despair, in a sense, is deeper than death. And I think when I read him, and I'm reading him from a slightly theological lens, I see him as he's trying to describe hell in a way, and I think he often makes references to it in some way or other, implicitly. But he's saying, hell is created by yourself, in a sense, how you relate to yourself, how you relate to the power that created you.
Yes.
But he is talking about hell. And so when he talks about eternity, to me, I take it a bit more literally, I think. I think he's referring to sort of ultimate destiny or something like that, rather than the kind of, again, sculpture and block time that you create.
Ultimate destiny is true of both statements. You don't see ultimate destiny as the sculpture. That's fine, but both of them are adequately described as ultimate destiny.
But one is living and one is dead. One is full of necessity and no possibility, and the other has possibility. And so that's I think where Kierkegaard would come in and say,
I don't know that the second one of them is dead, but fine. We can
jump into it at one point.
but go ahead, James.
I thought, to me, like, if we were to take it from a philosophical perspective, it like he describes it this way, so that regardless of your beliefs and
Sorry, Jim, your mic is cutting in and out.
wonder why I keep, how's that? Is that okay?
If you have to keep talking for me to be able to tell. Not hearing anything.
No, it's, yeah, look, okay. It seems like it's working. I see the light flashing.
Okay.
James,
If you keep,
It's coming through.
Do you have a built-in mic?
No, this is a mic that I usually have it set up. It's fine. It's just, it's, if it's not working, I'll just stop. But I see the light lighting up and I don't know why it's not coming through.
it's coming through now. Just go ahead.
Oh, okay, great. All I was going to say was it seems like he constructed it that way so that regardless of what you think of an afterlife, it's poignant and applicable. If I go the Christian route, I think that the people that are caught in despair eternally, because he's like, you can never die, right? That maybe
Yes.
Gabriel's alluding to that
Yes.
there is no death to free you from your suffering. That's
Yes.
sort of like what C.S. Lewis got at in The Great Divorce, that people get trapped in a way of thinking they can never escape, and they're frozen that way forever.
So
from a literary perspective,
think-
it was
I
used
think-
that way.
I think your point is fair, that he's formulating this in a way so that it will cover Gabriel's reading or mine, and in part because he wants it to be clear, persuasive, or intelligible either way, right? But fine, you can read what the whether the event of self-construction ends, and if so, in what manner, any way you like. There's still the fact that you are constructing this meant to be eternal version of yourself, right? And you can have any kind of theological understanding of that you like, right? But there's still this notion that the self is a relation to itself that is a synthesis through time of something temporal and something eternal, right? And however one chooses to understand that, that's what's necessary to give the concerns with self this kind of eternal weight, if I can put it that way, right? So partly fair objection, but I think that my reading of it is perfectly supportable, but maybe Gabriel's is as well. Either way, despair is this giving up on the eternal self, and that giving up on the eternal self is precisely about how to put it. It is the identity that you have one that you're going to be it's not even satisfied with, but is it going to be stable and satisfied in eternity, something like that. And that's why the forms of despair he talks about are all about things like what the person cannot stand about themselves, or what the person cannot stand about the world in which they are, right? All of these are questions of how a person relates to themselves and relates to what he calls the power that established them, right? And in both of those things, the question is whether or not there is satisfaction or not, resignation or not, defiance or not, right? All of them are relations of embracing, maintaining, keeping, sustaining, or changing, defying, trying to upset either side of that relation. Go ahead, Joe.
It sounds to me like the the part of the solution to this problem, especially if one were a Stoic and didn't believe in an afterlife, would be that you have to achieve your perfection of the sculpture before you die, and you're going to die tomorrow. Memento mori, Marcus Aurelius's famous saying. Okay, so the point is that he's saying nobody can do that. Nobody can get that way. Everybody's going to die imperfect and therefore in despair. And I'm not trying to say that, a well-lived life is always perfect, but if one is doing it right, one dies feeling totally proud of everything one ever did, and there's no despair.
Notice you just said that you just applied the Stoic standard that
I did.
well, but the point let's make sure we ticket it right. To be proud of what you did and to not be in despair, to put an equal sign between those two things is the Stoic standard, right? Whereas it's not Kierkegaard's standard. Kierkegaard thinks it's possible, entirely possible, to be not in despair while not being proud of what you did, right?
Oh, I understand. Okay, so he sees a Stoic null set. Good point. Good point.
It's not just a null. It's the Christian humility, right? Recognizes failings, trusts in a forgiveness for all of his screw-ups, instead of holding himself to a standard of pride and then judging only whether or not he reaches it. But you're right that in a way the Stoic standard is the self-construction, and this is covered on page 99. He talks about he wants to begin a little earlier than other people, not at Adam with the beginning, but in the beginning. He does not want to don his own self, does not want to see his task in his given self. He wants, by virtue of being the infinite form, to construct it himself. In other words, he wants to make both himself and the standard that he is applying, right? And he has, he talks about all there's various things about this which are attractive, but there is one problem with it, which appears on the end of page 100, right? But it is easy. The self is his own master, absolutely, as one says, its own master, and exactly this is the despair, but also what it regards its pleasure and joy. But it is easy on closer examination to see that this absolute ruler is a king without a country, that he really rules over nothing. His position, his kingdom, his sovereignty are subject to the dialectic that rebellion is legitimate at any moment. Ultimately, it is arbitrarily based upon the self itself. What's the point? The point of this is the Stoic who is making his own standards can change his own standards 5 minutes from now, and then the entire work of his previous life disappears into smoke. He's building on his own future will. Hang on, let me finish. He's building on his own future will, which he thinks he controls, but does not. And his own future will is going to want something different 5 minutes later. So from Kierkegaard's point of view, he's building on sand. He talks about the various things which they can do, right? Imperturbability, autarky, etc. They border on the fabulous. For sure they do, and beneath this there is nothing. The self wants in despair to savor the full the satisfaction of making itself into itself, of developing itself, being itself. It wants to take credit for this fictional masterly project, its own way of understanding itself. And yet what it understands itself to be is in the final instance a riddle. Just when it seems on the point of having the building finished, at a whim, it can dissolve the whole thing into nothing, right? Because he's leaving himself in the position of sovereign controller of what standard shall apply to him, 5 minutes from now, the sovereign standard can change to something completely different that will judge him completely differently. So the Stoic thinks that he is the author of all the standards and all the acts of his life, and perhaps he is, but the only thing that will determine whether or not those were a consistent life are his final regrets or lack thereof, right? Which you
or possibly
even the Stoics. Sorry, even the Stoics ask the question: can you tell if a man is happy before he's dead? Right. But anyway, that's a minor point about the Stoics themselves.
I didn't encounter that question, but that's a very good point, and I think the answer is no. One cannot never tell that because the life isn't finished yet.
Yes.
It seems to me that the real issue here is who would set the standards. Now, I do not detect as any kind of incredible defect the detail that during a life that we know is terminal, one maintains a standard and it terminates upon that death. You were pointing to the possibility.
That's not what he's saying.
I know we're talking about the possibility that during the life in the
Yes.
activity of the life, the person could, like, let me just use a slang term, could pull a Nietzsche and say, okay, I'm just switching this now around.
Yes.
Okay, well, I have to reply with, I guess, something like the no true Scotsman rebuttal.
Yes.
I wouldn't call that being a Stoic.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Right. You're absolutely right. And this is only his take on Stoicism, and Stoicism can go, defend itself if it wants, right? But the pulling an Nietzsche on it is exactly the right way to think about it, right? His concern here is that the self-controlling power that is supposedly the sovereign creator of the self here, right, looks remarkably like success. It looks remarkably like whatever comes next, whatever it be, because it's completely unconstrained, it's completely free, and it could change tomorrow. It's not grounded in anything. That is Kierkegaard's objection to it. Now, that might not be an objection to the Stoic or to a Nietzschean. The Stoic and the Nietzschean want to ground the project of their life only in their own will. Okay? What is their own will willing? This some one thing over here. Why? Because I willed it, right? So fine. Someone else 5 minutes later will look at the entire work of your life, emulate you in being willful, and reject everything that you did, right? So this way of constructing anything, either for yourself or among others, is built upon sand, is his claim. The way he puts it is, you are a sovereign ruler, but rebellion is legitimate at every moment, right? You have complete control, but until it goes away. Joe?
I don't understand this Alexander the Great complex. It's a background here. Why should anybody be totally concerned to build something for the ages? I mean, we can't all be a Ptolemy, or people who made up stuff that we actually don't even regard very highly anymore.
Let's be clear. When he's talking about building for the ages, he's not talking about because it's going to affect history or something, right? That would be only if you cared about history, right? He's just talking about the self-construction of the story of your life as this eternal project, right? Which is to have a self at all, right? But the key thing to understand about his diagnosis of the Stoa is someone who does know he has a self, right? He does see a project of his life to construct the story of his life, but he wants to be fully in charge of that project. He wants to be the sovereign controller of that project. And Kierkegaard's, recognizes that position, but he sees a despair in it, in the fact that there's nothing grounding it. It's an ungrounded ought is not an ought from his point of view, something like that. Now, I agree that a Nietzsche would laugh off this criticism. He doesn't care, right? He does not apply the standard to it that Kierkegaard would apply to it. But Kierkegaard, looking at it from the outside, sees any willful rebellion against this thing that you purely willfully created is just as legitimate as anything you willfully created. So there is no standard in it, right? So that's his objection to it, and maybe that's not a cogent objection for a certain psychology or a certain person, but that's his understanding of both where this Stoa is on this spectrum and what Kierkegaard's problem is with it. But I wanted to just, since this comes right before the section of the resentful raging, right? I wanted to sharply contrast this Stoic one, which doesn't necessarily have any resentment or rage in it at all, right? The thing that you can say is it might have a relationship to the power that established it, which is has too much of an element of defiance in it, so to speak. Why? The Stoa wants to be the author of his own life, and in that sense, he is rejecting his lineage. He doesn't care where he came from. He doesn't care what the universe gave him. He doesn't care about the cosmos that established him. He looks down on all those things because in his pride, he wants to be superior to them. He wants his own self and not his history, his nature, anything like that. The power that established him to be the thing which is responsible for his identity or his self. And from Kierkegaard's point of view, that's an element of still being alienated from himself. There's a part of himself that he's not accepting, where he came from, how he's made, right? He wants to be something that he is not. He wants to be this sovereign thing outside of causality and time and history and the cosmos. He wants to be this self-establishing, fully autarkic thing. Why? Because he finds something about himself that he cannot stand or that he despises if he is not so august and autarkic a thing. There's a line in Nietzsche where he says, but away with all gods. What could one create if gods existed? Though I drew this thought, now it draws me, right? His point is, because he wants to be a creator, he has to deny all the things which might be constraints on creation, on his own creation, right? So there is an element there that is something like a resentment of a powerlessness or a lack of omnipotence. It's like you're not accepting of your own finitude, of your own limitations. You want to be the self-author of your being, because if you thought of yourself as anything less than the self-author of your being, you would have a secret contempt for yourself, right? It's like if you weren't the omnipotent self-author of your being, you would look down upon yourself with a sneer, something like that. That's the diagnosis. Whether or not it's accurate, that's the diagnosis. Sorry, Jim, you had a question.
Yeah. So would it be safe to say that he uses Christ as the ultimate grounding to avoid the Stoic, let's say, evaporating standard created by their own will, because it is unattainable, as Joe was saying, like, you're never going to do that. Is he using it that way to make sure that someone will always have something impossible to achieve, so that it doesn't so that whatever they're creating can't evaporate?
Let's read part 2. Is my answer to that question. But partially yes. What we're going to get in part 2 is his, instead of part 1 is just diagnosing what despair is in its many forms. Part 2 is going to be something like judging it, or if this is what his despair is, what do we make of it? What judgment do we have upon it? And the judgment of part 2 is going to be that despair is sin. There is affront in despair. There is a moral wrong in despair. And that's going to be the substance of part 2, right? So the claim is not just that this is some lack of psychological health, or being less than you could fully be, or it's not just a you could do better, son, kind of first part. That's all the first part. The second part is going to be more like, and to the extent that you don't try to do more, right? You're giving the finger to your maker. Not to put too fine a point upon it, right?
Nice point.
Who was expecting that of you, right? So that's the kind of attitude that we're going to get in part 2, right? And that's the element in which he's going to see something like sin in it. Sorry, I'm going to have to switch mics for just a second and get another cup of coffee. I'm going to pause the recording for just a second.
Okay, I think we're back. Cool. So I don't know if I cut somebody off in the middle of something. If someone had a comment they wanted to make on the stuff we just went before, because we had to stop because of my power. So I might have interrupted someone, but if not, I've got a definite thing I want to go into next. But first, if there's just anyone who is trying to make a point they were eager to make and didn't get to. I see 3, 4 muted, 5 muted, so probably not. I don't know if James is back yet.
Yeah, I'm back. I just muted the video because Ariel's going to come back in. I didn't want that to interrupt.
Got it. Jim, you're a little bit far away at the moment.
Yeah, I set the mic down.
Oh, no problem.
I just muted the video so that we could, so that when Ariel comes back in, it's not distracting.
No problem. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some of the possibility, necessity, finite, infinite sort of changes he rings through in these early versions of the unconscious forms of despair. And there's a couple of these things I found, just incredibly striking that I want to just give people's reactions to. And the first is his picture of the person who is foundering in possibility because they have too much of it. They see infinite possibilities. So first of all, just why is this category of possible matter? There's something like, the self is a relation to itself, right? So you've got an A and another A that you're relating to one another. And action is something like, determinately changing what your future self is, and possibility is like a space of all those things. If that space gets too infinite, then your identity evaporates, right? You're just lost in possibilities. You don't make a decision. You're flitting from one thing to another, right? It's the person who can't settle down, can't concentrate on something, can't commit to one thing, right? So he calls this: the self runs away from itself in possibility, so that there's no necessity to return to. He says, and this is the striking line: becoming oneself is a movement one makes just where one is. I love that line, right? Any becoming is a movement from some place, but becoming oneself is a movement at that place, right? So to become yourself is a movement you have to perform at the place where you are. And he's not just using that in some vacuous sense. He's saying you have to tie to your actual past. You don't get to be a completely abstract future person that has no relation to who you have always been. You cannot become yourself by a change of place that rewrites yourself from a blank page. Because becoming yourself is movement one makes just where one is. You are always already situated. This is the thing that Heidegger would make much of as being thrown into the world, right? You have a positioning and a past that is part of you, and if you're alienated from it, you're not yourself. So that's just striking stuff on this is on page 66, and then he talks about. Sorry, Anthony, question.
Yeah. So when I don't know, like, 'cause when you say that and like that aspect, it makes me think of this, and I guess I wanted to throw this out there. Is that kind of like, when I hear that, I think of the struggle between becoming an individual and realizing that you are an individual, and part of like what makes you an individual is tethered to your past experiences, and trying the attempt to become this individual that's not to that is throwing away part of what makes you an individual. So maybe it's the like tension between those things. And then the part about making a decision reminds me of another quote that he said. I can't remember where it's from, but he says, anxiety, I think it's probably an concept of anxiety, that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. And basically to restrict yourself to where you are is to rather than these infinite possibilities of where this abstract idea of where you might be could, and then to center down as this is who I am really, and this is my past experience, can kind of hunker down and focus it. I don't know. That's what I was thinking.
So we're going to get to that in just a second, but yes, you're right. I mean, and this is exactly this point about Kierkegaard is an individualist in the following sense, right? He wants everyone to be responsible for becoming the individual that they are, right? And it is to him of infinite concern that it be that individual and not some fake other copy, right? You don't want to be a factory product, right? You're unique, and you should have there's a question of how reconciled you are to your uniqueness, or how alienated you are from your uniqueness, something like that. But if you're going to be true to a uniqueness, to an individuality, you have to. There's a part of that which is the necessity of an acceptance of where you come from, of where you are, right? That's this point about it's a movement that takes place at one place. Your point about dizziness of possibility. This is the very next paragraph. He talks about how someone can, seem to have more and more possibility, and he says that when possibility gets too large, the actuality is sort of disappearing, right? Just when one thing seems possible, some new possibility arises, and finally these phantasms succeed one another with such speed that it seems as though everything were possible. And that is the very moment the individual himself has finally become nothing but an atmospheric illusion, right? If you're not actually something, you're an atmospheric illusion. You're just a blur, right? If a chain of successive, possibility after possibility that are changing, incredibly rapidly, are flitting in front of you, and you're fixated on each of them, right? You have disappeared. You have evaporated, right? there needs to be a tethering in necessity and past and continuity and self for any project of self-mastery, self-authoring, or self-creation to bring you along with, right? If you're just focused on the where you're going to, and you flip from pillar to post about that, the you evaporates, and you just have a succession of visions of other things. And his diagnosis of that is the reason for that sort of fixation is an unprocessed dissatisfaction with oneself, right? You're living in the future possible because you don't like where you are now. There's something about yourself that you don't like that you're not facing. And so you live in the future projected possible, and then that one doesn't really satisfy. So another one comes along, and another one comes along, right? And you flip from one to the next. But this is a process of flight, right? Heidegger makes the same kind of point of being in time, that there's a sense in which some of these things are a flight from oneself. Right? Okay, so this is the point about, he calls this lack of actuality, the person's becoming unreal. And he says, on closer examination, what the life self really lacks is necessity. Limits. He says, even to see oneself in a mirror, one must recognize oneself, for unless one does that, one does not see oneself, but only a human being. The mirror of possibility is no ordinary mirror. It must be used with the utmost caution. So what's the point of that? The point of that is you have to have some sense of identity even to see you in the future ideal you're trying to be, right? If you're trying to, change yourself according to some, possibility or image flitting before you, right? Unless there's you in that thing, you're just trying to run away from yourself, right? You're not bringing yourself along, so to speak. The continuity with the past is missing. It says there's two essential ways of running away from things in possibility: the wishful or hankering, and the melancholic fantastic. The second is, if the thing you're fixated on is a fear or a dread instead of an enticing thing. Question, Ariel?
Yes, my question was just to confirm. So when he says even a small possibility needs some time to become actual, by time he means the past rather than there's a possibility, and you need to, in your current self going into the future, take the time and decision to dedicate yourself in order to actualize that possibility.
That's right. So it's the actualization part. You have to stay focused. You have to stay on the same track long enough to make some actual forward progress where there's no real possibility there. The possibility doesn't become real unless you stay on that track long enough to get somewhere and bring yourself along with, right?
Oh, okay. So he's talking about the implementation of it now into the future in order for the possibility to become actuality. By time, he's not talking about your past.
No, he's talking about
being the time in which it was.
He's saying you have to stick
Okay.
with that possibility and dispense with all the other possibilities around it. You have to choose, and choosing is picking one of the possibles and rejecting all the other possibles, and then treating that as a necessity that you stick with for a period and span of time. And his point is that if you don't stick with something for a span of time, it's not even a possibility anymore, because it never becomes actual enough to have been a possibility. It just flitted by you. It wasn't a real possibility at all. Possibilities only become real by being actualized, and they get actualized by throwing away all the other ones around them.
Okay. I misunderstood the point about the past, not negating the past in order to be yourself. I thought that was in relation to what
they are connected, because one moment into that future, it's your past decision that you're sticking with, right? And 2 moments in, it's that 2 moments ago, right? You have to be anchored by your past decisions, right, and the necessity that those imposed, or you're not going to be actualizing.
Oh, the past in that sense, not the past before you decided to dedicate the time to make it an actuality. Okay.
You've always already made such decisions. You're never in a time for the first decision, right? You're always on a path, right? Yes, exactly.
Yes. Very good. Thank you.
Yep, good question. Okay. So this is the first point about, the danger of infinite possibility, right? The danger of infinite possibility is that you don't commit enough to something, and the diagnosis of why that's happening is the dragging your past along doesn't seem appetizing enough, because there's all the possibility mongering or seeking is a dissatisfaction with the past that's not being faced, something like that. But there's the opposite extreme. The opposite extreme is when you feel like you've run out of possibility, when it seems like only one thing is possible, and not only that, it's possible, it's necessary, it's going to happen, you can't do anything about it, and not only that, it's disastrous. It's something you cannot stand, something you cannot abide, right? And that's where he brings in the faith business, right? This is where he first brings up not faith in almost the practical sense before even faith in the Christian sense, right? This is 68, necessity to despair is to lack possibility. And he says, the decisive thing, for God, everything is possible. This is eternally true and therefore true in every moment. And people say this, but that's not the question. The question is whether or not when all possibility seems to have disappeared, the person will have faith or not, right? This passage reminds me of some things in later Chesterton where he talks about the same kind of question. He says someplace, it might be a piece of ordinary advice for mountaineers, right? But by which he means something like, it is only on those who hold on 5 minutes after everything seems hopeless that hope begins to dawn, right? There's a purely practical utility in not going under because there's no hope, right? So there's a purely practical aspect of the utility of hope, that it's hope precisely when there's no reason to be hopeful, right? That's when you need it, right? The hope you have when everything looks hopeful is like, surplus to requirements. The hope you really need is when rational hope seems to have run out. And there's two utilities there. There's the one utility, the spiritual utility, which he's focused on, but there's also just the practical utility, right? Despairing is not going to help you there. Giving up is not going to help you there. So there's a sense in which even hope is a practical virtue, not hope, faith or hope in that sense is a practical virtue. And that's the point that Chesterton is making, is that hope is a practical virtue. But the point he's making here is that there's something else at stake in any such crisis, which is not whether or not you get out of the crisis in the sense of you avoid the consequence, right? Whatever it is that seems to be threatening you, but whether or not you get out of the crisis, by which I mean, does your identity survive the experience? That's the question. Do you give up hope in the integration of a temporally extended you through your life, right? Or do you despair? Do you give up in some wider identity constituting sense? And that's the aspect of it that he's worried about, right? This is the thing that the typical religiosity refers to as it's a test, right? It's any of these things is a test for how you respond to it. More than it is the import of the event itself is in how you respond to it, whereas in the how you respond to the test that it constitutes. That's the common sort of psychological spiritual point here. But the other point he's making is just that in some sense, the integrity of oneself and its moral cast, so to speak, is at stake whenever you're close to hopelessness. Why? Partly this is the thing we're going to get at the end of the section about the demonic raging despair, right? Are you going to be precipitated by some horrible event that happens to you into a rage against existence itself, right? Or despair in the other forms we're going to see later. But that's a danger that's there in every seeming disaster. It's not just I thought I was going to be submerged by the flood and gave up hope before the log drifted by that I was able to grab onto. Are you able to grab onto a log floating by? Right. One question of that is do you drown? The other question is whether or not you wreck the whole moral character of your life by how you're reacting to the possibility of drowning. Let's put it that way. But that's something even a Stoic would see as a live issue, but a Christian sees it as an even liver issue, so to speak. Anyway, this is the point about the hopefulness. And his point there is that a little bit of possibility is what lets a person breathe there, and this is the claim that a self cannot breathe without possibility. There has to be some openness to a possible future, a possible decision, a possible thing I maybe not even weigh out, but a something which is up to me and how I face it, at the very least, right? And this is the point which is, I think, first of all, psychologically true, but second of all, it's something which you find later in the existential analysis, being in time about care, and there's this aspect of us which is possibility, time navigating decision makers, decision pilots, right? And we need that just in front of us future with real possibilities in it that matter to us, that are up to us in some sense, to give weight and meaning to action, right? Make action possible, and removal of the possibility of action in a meaningful sense, in the sense of anything that you could do, even inwardly, to change how your circumstances even feel to you, right? That's something that the self cannot abide, so to speak. It's like being suffocated to lack possibility in that sense. And Kierkegaard's psychological point is that even absurd hope works in those circumstances. It doesn't matter how rational or absurd the hope is, you need the hope, right? So someone who came along and told you, in the fashion of the pilot in the asteroid belts, the chances of successfully navigating this asteroid field are 1,000,000 to 1 against, not helping, right? He just needs to know he could make it, right? He doesn't need a probability estimate. He needs to keep flying, right? And the thing that's going to keep him flying is the fact that there's any chance at all, right? Okay, so just reactions to any of those, either extreme, the extreme of too much possible, the extreme of not enough possible. Joe?
Well, I think that it's entirely entirely correct. I can visualize a cartoon, a line drawing cartoon of two people in a coal mine, and it's dark, and they're obviously dying and suffocating, and one of them says to the other, "Well, the minute you die, somebody will rescue us. So don't die yet."
Yes, right. Yes. Other reactions to the? Go ahead, Jim.
So it was along these lines, but maybe a little bit earlier, where he starts to compare the person who has untethered emotion, when it's and reflecting on possibility, and that it's debilitating sickness akin to an arthritic. So I was like, that reminds me of, hate to say it, I don't hate to say it, I'll just say it. People that every little thing triggers them. That's what it's like to be arthritic. Oh no, the weather changed. Now I can't move. My joints are stiff, and I'm just, my knee, that ankle I broke. Oh, the wind's too stiff, and they have absolutely zero stability with their emotions, because every little thing triggers something like a sickness, like arthritics. And I found that striking with the current social milieu, with the social justice movement. Everything's getting canceled because everybody gets triggered every time the weather changes emotionally for them. And then I just thought that was interesting. And then now you're talking about how that sort of intersects with his ideas about too much possibility.
That is partly what he's talking about there, but I mean, on 61, he's also just talking about this infinite sensitivity that is too abstract because it's not connected enough with you, right? So talking about emotion becoming fantastic, more and more volatilized, becomes kind of abstract sensitivity, which inhumanly belongs to no human, but inhumanly participates in sensitivity, so to speak. Dealing with humanity in the abstract, right? What is the point of this? The point of this is you can become sensitive to things which are so remote from your actual life, right? That you're getting flightily upset in the way that you're talking about, but precisely about things which don't have any actual necessary relation to you. They're occurring in this infinite sphere of fantasy, right? So and his point of this is that this is a way in which it says that the human self is being squandered, like a person in a brass band who only plays one note. What is the point of that? He's first of all, he's just pointing out the fact that fantasy can go infinite on you, right? That's the first point. It's an aspect of infinity about fantasy. But the other is that the things that people can be sensitive to can be so remote from their own life that they're not really connected to themselves, right? They're worried about something which is completely abstract. They're worried about something which is volatilized, so to speak. That which is furthest away from what you can actually do. The thing which is grounding compared to that is for the things about which you care to be the things that could matter for what you could actually do in the next moment, right? This is the old thing about, is your mind on where you are and what you are doing, or is it, off in what will happen 10 years from now in Timbuktu if you happen to visit it, right? You can fantasize about things that are more and more remote from the actual circumstances of your life, and this is one of the way that people just run away from the circumstances of their own life, right? That you don't want to live in the here and now because there's things about it that you don't like, so you're not facing them, but instead you live in a world of fantasy of what could be in the future, what is for someone else, right? And as you invest in those things, you care about and therefore can be upset by whatever is happening with them, even though they have nothing to do with you and your practical problems and what you have to do in the next 10 minutes, right? So this is what he means by it's a way in which the self becomes volatilized. It's like not only do people get touchy, but it's like they're not there. They're not paying attention to their life. They're living everybody else's life. They're living the life of concern that they see in the world around them, not the things that they could actually do anything about in the next 5 minutes, right? So that's the version of volatilized that he's talking about. It's this, and yes, that means that things just happen to these people, right? If you're in a situation where you're not narrowing your sphere of concern to the things you could actually control or determine, in a short period in the future, then things infinitely far from you can upset you, right? So something, if you expand the radius of things you care about far enough away and far enough away from your action, something will be going on somewhere, right? In that wider sphere that will catch your attention, bother you, whatever. You're volatilized, you're out at the horizon, and the result is you're going to be inundated with signal, and you're also not going to be able to do anything about any of it, right? So this is the flighty, volatilized, things just happen to you because you're a sounding board for everything that happens anywhere in the universe. Instead of being focused on this small bubble around yourself that you could actually affect, your imagination is expanded to this giant bubble that includes so much in it that there's always something going horribly wrong with some part of it.
So essentially, it's like how Jordan Peterson says, clean your room before you focus on the world around you.
Yeah, I mean, there's maybe other things going on in that too, but yes, some focus on the things which are close enough to you and grounded enough in your own life that you can change, but not only so that so you can change them, but also because there's an element of that widening which is just an avoidance, right? It's just a way of running away from the here and now and the things that are actually, you know, about to matter. So there's an element of the psychological acuteness of this whole first section, which is just finding all the ways in which people dodge responsibility, you know, dodge their problems, run away from the weighty responsibility, the dizzying responsibility, as Anthony was telling us earlier, of being responsible for yourself. Yeah, it calls, you know, despair is also a kind of distraction. This is a 74, 75. Okay. Right, and he calls this the distraction form of despair the most common form of despair. What does he mean by this? This is someone who is just looking to get lost in business. They're just looking to get lost in whatever either the entertainment or the affairs of the day or whatever. They're never inward. They're never focused on anything longer term. They're just distracting themselves as often as possible to avoid having to do anything weighty or anything inward or anything committed, right? And the diagnosis, what I think is fair, is that that's ordinary everyday people, right? It's the rule rather than an exception. It's not an extreme case of, you know, someone who's in, you know, in a Great Depression, so to speak. We're not talking about, you know, clinically depressed people. We're just talking about people who are distracted and distracting themselves to avoid, you know, dealing with anything serious, and they're flitting along through life from momentary care to momentary care. It's fair to say that there's an element of that diagnosis that, while accurate, is also distinctly uncharitable, right? There's an element of it which is a lot of the severity for the sort of everyday religiosity he sees around him in Denmark that drives him nuts in the last 3 years of his life because it seems so fake, is this same kind of flitting distraction, right? It's like he has this weighty ethical demand that everyone always be, you know, completely focused on this, deep internal struggle thing. And you can ask, how fair is that, right? He himself acknowledges that for most people, most of the time, no, they're not going to live up to that, right? Now, that said, I still think that psychologically, he's right to identify this as people are avoiding a responsibility whenever they're doing that self-distraction game. They're not taking themselves as seriously as they could be taking themselves. They're taking a break from being serious. And it's fine to take a break from being serious, except if you do it for your whole life, right? If you do it for your whole life, there will be consequences of never taking yourself at what you're doing seriously. Okay, but fine questions. Right, so I want to move ahead. We've had some good discussion, a bunch of these things. I want to move ahead to some of the stuff we talked about earlier, sort of before its time, of the critical forms of despair, right? The two most critical forms of despair are the ones that are conscious, and those are the despair of weakness, of not wanting to be oneself, and the despair of defiance of wanting to be oneself, which will have two forms we'll get to. But let's first talk about the despair of weakness. The conscious despair of weakness is something like a person acknowledges they have a self, but treats it as a passive thing which is just happening to them, which they wish weren't, right? It's like having the responsibility to be crafting the ethical content of your life, right? Seems like a cosmic torture device in which you are trapped, rather than as, you know, some heroic project in which you are engaged. You're the victim rather than the hero of the tale, but a despairing victim, a weak one, right? You're treating the you don't feel like you're up to it, right? Clearly enough. So, and his claim is that people in this state, they do know what despair is. They have not a full philosophical, his version understanding what despair is, but they do have some notion of what despair is and of being in despair. Right, so.
If I'm gonna make a comment on that.
Sure.
That is where I think the popular notion of I didn't ask to be born. You know you're in despair, you know yourself, but you're like, this is a chore that has been unjustly thrusted upon me against my will and without my consent, and it's something
Right.
I have to contend with bitterly.
And the bitterness version of the reaction to that we'll get to
right
a little farther on. The kind of reaction that he's talking about here is the kind that, you know, makes a person suicidal. It's not raging against the world. It's like, you know, wanting to check out, right? It's the and you know, he'll have his own, you know, take on all that, but he's talking about someone who is, in our sense of the term, you know, most truly clinically depressed, right? And who the truer a person's conception of despair, the more clearly conscious he is of being despair, the more intense is his despair. The person who commits suicide in the consciousness that suicide is despair, and thus the far more true conception of despair is in a more heightened state of despair than someone who doesn't, right? So the point of this is right. And he mentions multiple versions of this. There's the kind of person who has nothing to do but play dead, right? He just leaves off trying to make any decision in his life, and is just paralyzed, right? And then he says, however, time passes. If some help comes from the side, life is restored to despair. He begins where he left off, right? This form of despair is not wanting to be oneself, or even level, not wanting despair to be a self, or lowest of all, wanting in despair to be someone else, wanting a new self, right? So this is a person who feels like they're not at home in their own body, a person who feels like they're, you know, they don't belong in the world. It's that kind of despair of they don't want to be themselves, they want to be something else, they don't want to be at all, right? This is the thing which we most clearly regard as despair in the sense of complete despondency. And one of his points there is that this is often something that people hide, right? They're ashamed of the fact that they are in this kind of despair. There's a sense in which they know that to despair in this fashion is something shameful, and they hide it from others even more than from themselves. There's sometimes a sense in which it's worse if others can see it, so to speak. He gives the example of the drunken peasant, the funny example of the drunken peasant who, gets a bunch of money, goes into town, buys the new shoes and stockings, gets drunk, lies down on the road, and the wagon comes along and says, move out of the road. And he says, oh, you can run over those legs. They're not my legs, right? Because, you know, he doesn't recognize a piece of himself, right? But that's the kind of despair he's talking about here. I think that there's something curious going on in this passage. It's in a way the place where it's a form of despair for which we're sort of naturally have the most compassion, right? It's the thing which evokes in us the most sense of just pity for someone in this state. But he doesn't simply have pity for it. He still has this sense of the person is responsible for being in this state. Anyway, just he also has there's a bunch of places there where he talks about the he kind of ridicules part of the concern with it. It's like people are concerned with this level of despair because it seems like they're they're losing something. They're worried about the externals of it all. They're worried about how other people perceive the fact they're in despair. They're worried about oh, I've lost myself. That's a conversion of property, right? You know, I was owed that, and now I didn't get it, right? They want to address a spiritual crisis with the categories of the world, with the categories of common worldly existence. If people just don't know about it, it'll be fine, right? Kind of reactions. But reading this to me is hard because there's a part of me that wants him to show more compassion for a person in this state than he's showing. There's an element of what he's doing here, which is almost clinical, if I can put it that way. And yes, a psychologist should be clinical in these cases to understand what he's dealing with, but there's an element of it which is almost dissecting clinical. It's like the patient is on the operating table and he's just poking around to see how it works. I can come back from that reaction because I realize he's been in this. You know, I know that he is telling this from the inside, right? That's the cure here. But the point I'm getting at is you can read this passage, and if you don't take into account that he suffered this himself, it can easily come off as just cruel. It's just a cruel dissection of someone in this state. But what he's actually, trying to say is, the depressed person who does not want to be himself still has this responsibility for being in that state, and above all, can't commit suicide. Right? That's sort of his message here, and this is definitely something meant for himself as well as for others, and it's a necessary strength in that. Right? You can't give way to pity here; it doesn't help. He makes the point there that for Stoics, suicide may seem a completely inconsequential matter because it doesn't inconvenience anyone else. What a person does with themselves is, what they're doing with their own property, and it shouldn't be anybody else's business. And that's very far from his attitude towards it, or the Christian attitude towards it, he says, I think rightly. But anyway, to me, this is some of the more difficult psychological terrain that we go through here before we get to the other two parts of despair. Any other reactions to the despair of not wanting to be yourself? No. Okay. We go on to the fun ones, the despair of wanting to be yourself. I say the fun ones because they're the more heroic ones in a way, right? They're the ones that are ending the chapter, and we've got two of them. And there's the one we talked about the most, which is the Stoic one. We went over with Joe and explained sort of what's going on there. But we have to talk about the last, the one that we see as the character from fiction can recognize from Dostoevsky, right? What he calls the demonic will form of despair and defiance.
I did have one thing to say about what we were just talking about.
Okay, go.
A quote that came to my mind that I think sums up what he was saying and his attitude about, a person who is in that type of despair. We have compassion for them because it's like, oh, you poor thing. But he also makes the distinction of like, that is still the responsibility. It made me think of the quote, and I forget the person who says this, but mental illness is nobody's fault, but it is your responsibility. It's kind of a harsh reality that everyone has to realize because,
and to some parts, sometimes for some parts of it, sometimes it is your fault too, right? I mean, but maybe not all, but there are kinds that are. Let's put it that way. There are kinds that are. What you can't do typically is get yourself out of it just because you're responsible for it. That's a different story. That's a different story. And he would admit that it's not something where he's not saying, oh, just pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Nothing like that here, right?
Yes.
Okay, but now let's get to the one that's ending the chapter, which is the kind of rage version. This is a person who he says wants to be himself, but he wants to be himself as someone in despair or as someone suffering. We would say he wants to be the victim. Right? This is someone who wants to be themselves only in the sense that they dislike where they are. They dislike what is happening to them. They dislike what their life is, but they don't want to change it. They want to use it as an accusation to be flung at the world, at God, at society around them, at history, at fate, whatever. They are defying the cosmos that made them suffer so by hugging their suffering close, right? They want to be the victim of the heroic tale of their life, right? They want to be the innocent, put upon, mangled a thing that shows the moral effrontery or outrageousness of existence. Joe?
I've been trying to sort of think during this entire discussion, into which category might you and I best sort of position or slot in the typical or the stereotypical social justice warrior types.
Don't go there. Don't go there, Joe. We're not having that conversation.
No, I don't want to ask that conversation, but I just want to say this last category sounds like it.
No, there definitely are people in this category from every possible camp, so to speak. I don't think this is a political thing. I think this is a psychological thing. It's a spiritual thing, right? I mean, but it's also a very old reflection, right? This is Cain, right? This is you can read certain poems of the young Marx and find this in them, or of Proudhon, right? You can find it in some of the early Romantic poets, right? Who made Prometheus their champion, right? Why? Because he's tortured by the deity but defies the deity, right? And that was their model of the heroic. I wouldn't pigeonhole it into too narrow or modern or contemporary, right? A camp, and I would avoid trying to label it. This is also the mentality of the disaffected teen who bombs his high school, right? This is the I'm going to make the whole world see that existence is an outrage. You find this also in some of the characters in Dostoevsky, who are like trying to convince the other characters around them that there's so much horror in the world that the world shouldn't exist, right? Characters like that. I was thinking Brothers Karamazov, for example. But so that's the kind of resentment he's talking about here, and his understanding of it psychologically and in his schema is this is someone who only wants to be themselves in despair because there's something about existing the way they are that they consider so horrible that they want to embrace that horror to fling it back as a defiant challenge to existence itself, something like that. I think he's very acute on the subject. He does mention, I think someone else mentioned this before, that characters of this purity are more seen in fiction than in real life, right? It's harder to find someone in real life who exactly exemplifies this. You see glancing versions of this, but it's an ideal type that is often there and drawn in many a morality as a standing danger, if I can put it that way, right? And I think he's right about that. There's any number of moral teachings in the world that will have some version of this figure of resentment or rage as one foil of a dichotomy that they're using to orient people. This is the description on 103. He then heaps upon this torment all his passion, which becomes a demonic rage. If it should now happen that God in heaven and all the angels were to offer to help rid him of this torment, no, he does not want that now. Now it is too late. Once he would have gladly have given everything to be rid of his agony, but he was kept waiting. And now that's all past. He prefers to rage against everything and to be the one whom the whole world, all existence has wronged. The one for whom it is especially important to ensure that he have his agony at hand so that no one will take it from him. for then he would not be able to convince others and himself that he is right. So the he was kept waiting part of that. There's a sense of this as a kind of outraged majesty, and he's detecting an element of pride in it, right? That how dare the universe touch me in this way, right? Something like that.
Would you say that the agony is something that's become part of the person's identity, and that's now they've lived with it so long and they've internalized it, and so it's part of their pride?
Yes, you're right. They've incorporated their agony or their victimhood into their identity, and they're now proud of it. But it's a perverse pride. It's a pride which is I am the suffering proof that existence is unjust, something like that. And the part of that which is convince others and himself that he is right. There's an element of this which is part of like the opposite of cognitive dissonance is like a cognitive integrity, right? The person's explanation for the story of their life and for what they did or left undone in their life has to not have them be the villain of the tale, has to not have them be the person who screwed up at some point. It has to be anything else's fault, right? And why? So that the there's an element of the consciousness of their past and what brought them there, and their identity integrity in that, which is at stake in it being the world that was wrong, not me, right? I didn't do something wrong to not fit into this world. The world was so constituted that no decent person could fit into it, right? So this is a way of maintaining a sense of the decency of oneself at the expense of the decency of the world, right? Gabriel?
As you were saying that, it sort of made me think of Job, the story of Job, in the sense that, he's on the surface at least quite unjustly treated by God and suffers quite terribly, and would be very prone to exactly this kind of demonic despair. But there's that interesting turn in the story where God appears to him, doesn't really give him any explanation. But what appears to happen, depending how you read it, is that instead of having that clinging to his suffering, instead of having that sort of righteous indignation, he sort of just lets it go, and he lets God restore everything to him. And as I was reading Kierkegaard talk about this, it sounds very much like, the pain of humility to the person in this kind of despair is more than the actual suffering that they're suffering. And they'd rather have the suffering than the humility. And it also helps me a little bit make sense of that story of Job. I know Jung reads the story in a very different way, sort of casts God in more of a bad light. But, this might be more of this might be a different way to read Job, is the sense that he's willing, without this sort of explanation or without demanding a justification, to just let the suffering go, and therefore he doesn't get trapped in despair or lost in despair.
I think that's right. I think that's the first of all, you're right that to line up with Job, I think there's a similar kind of reading of Job in Chesterton, if I'm not wrong. And you read it the first time and it's striking. Job wants to reason with God. He wants to contend with God. He wants to ask God what God is up to. That this is what is going on. He's not challenging God. He's not saying God was wrong. He wants to know what the story is. He wants to get the straight scoop from the man himself, right? Why, right? And the God's answer is, I am large. I am way bigger than you. Look at all my works. Look at all that I have done. And Job repents in sackcloth and ashes, right? It's not that he's in any way explaining the particulars of what happened to Job, or that he isn't, or that Job has any explanation there. It is exactly this sort of humility versus resentment kind of point. And I think that you're right that part of when he's diagnosing this element of both pride and of trying to maintain the coherence of consciousness, right? Both of those have as their foil, as their opposite, humility here would be too painful, right? Humility would shatter that past justification of all the decisions that brought me to this, and it would shatter the pride of I feel affronted that these things were done to me. So leaving aside any justice in the matter, right? The psychological utility in the matter is humility here will heal, and resentment here will destroy. That's the message. Yeah, and things like this are why I think Kierkegaard has the deserved reputation for being a psychologically acute thinker, right? This is the kind of depth of insight about psychology that you only get from folks like him. When I say folks like him, existential tradition, there's people in psychologist tradition, there's other people in the religious traditions, and not only that one, but in others in Buddhism, for example. You get this kind of psychological acuteness in the religious thinkers and the mystics and the existentialists and the psychologists, and you don't get it from people who aren't in those schools. Great. So I've gotten through the stuff I wanted to cover in this section. I want to briefly set up the next section because I already talked about it just a little bit, that the next part is going to be despair is sin. And one way to think about this is in all of that, there was this this element of self-piloting, self-construction, where the self can get stuck, so to speak. But there was also an undertone of before God in it. And the whole next section is going to be, what is the ethical status of despair? Is despair something that just happens to us that is innocent? Is despair something that is a misfortune? Or is despair a wrong that we are responsible to and duty bound to not commit, right? And that's sort of what the second whole path is going to be about. Are we duty bound to not despair, right? That's sort of what the despair is sin thing is about. So that's the if I put it this way, the first part was psychological. The second part is going to be ethical. It's going to be asking for that same psychology, right? What can you morally require of a person who is subject to possible despair? Something like that. And that's also, beyond the stage of the ethical for Kierkegaard's point of view, there's a stage of the religious as well. The part of the place where we've heard this in the early section, it's going to come back again. In the early section, he gave his formula for what not being in despair was. And the formula for not being in despair is that the self, we would say, is at peace with itself, but it's not just at peace with itself, it's at peace with the power that established it, right? It is, in our sense, satisfied or has peace of mind or is at home with itself, right? But not just with itself, but in the universe it's actually in, right? At home with the power that established it, not alienated from either itself or the universe, either itself or God, right? So that's what we're going to get in the second half. Is that's going to come back out, and the ethical and religious notes are going to be on display more than the psychological ones. Not the psychological ones will go away, but there's going to be, so far we've got a bunch of diagnosis and some formulas for what counts as the opposite of these things. Now he's going to take us through the ethical and religious level of judging any of those things. Okay, that's just preview for what comes next. All right, and now that really is the end of what I wanted to prepare, but I leave room for questions. We've gone over a bunch of territory here, and there are both questions about particular passages people didn't understand, parts of the conception that didn't make sense, reactions to things you read or things in the discussion that just floor open. Is that Ariel?
I just wanted to say that you are a really good explainer. I don't know if are you posting these discussions? Because I missed the one on Levinus, who I like, but boy, very, very hard to read, and it was a long selection.
Well, thank you. So the answer is yes. I am posting the recordings on YouTube. At the end of each, you have to go back to a past meetup to see it, right? But if you go to a past meetup, there'll be in the discussions down below, I post the link each time. And it's out to a single channel, just my name, Jason Cawley, on YouTube. And if you put in the name of the book that we're doing, you might find it. If there aren't too many people talking the same thing. But my name.
Yeah, I made a note of the ones that I missed that I like, so I can do that. Thanks.
Great. Yes, this one should be put up later tonight after it takes a couple hours to process, but great. Thanks. So Ariel, did you want to jump with your question?
Yes, it wasn't a question, more so a reaction.
Okay.
That I think really kind of solidified when he was talking about the reserve type, and the problem of the reserve type faces is that they realize they're in despair and then view the despair as a weakness, as something they ought not to have done. And they are then in despair of the weakness of having been in despair and or being still in despair because of that weakness. I find that really, really cool because what he's saying throughout the book and in there further solidifying is that you shouldn't run away from being despair. You should try to be as conscious of your despair as possible, not because you're ultimately not ever supposed to have been in despair, but through your despair, you realize how to become your full self, and thus you are no longer in despair. But the going through the despair part is sort of like the trenches, the growing pains that you must go through in order to grow into yourself. You cannot skip it or try to get past it or distract from it. And I think that's a really cool way he kind of nodded to the overarching theme of the first part of the book was in that part where it's like the despair is not the weakness is to despair over despairing. So yeah, I really thought that was a cool button.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It's very well said. Very well said, first of all. There's an element of despair that he thinks you do have to face and go through, so to speak. It's also, from his point of view, if you're deep enough in despair, do you or do you not ask for help? Right? All of these forms of despair have some way in which they are rooted in a pride about how weak or how strong or how unjust or whatever you view yourself or the world, and they have one antithesis: asking for help. That's the thing that it's not just going through despair. You have to be willing to ask for help at the bottom of the despair, so to speak, from his point of view. So and that will come out more in the second half. But so as for the reserved type, right? The reserved type is a social interest to him because it's a very common thing in the sort of culture around him. Right? You don't show. In the culture around him, you don't show weaknesses like this. If you have an inward side to you, you stoically mask it in an outward brave face, and you may have something secretly wounded about you, but you keep it covered up. It's not an emotive culture. Let's put it that way. The reserved thing is a natural thing of there are people who just don't even notice. They're clueless or distracted, but there are people who get deeper in a sense. They have an inward side. They seem weightier. They seem have gravitas or something, but they're also very reserved about it. They won't tell you what's up. They don't open up to, he gives the example of someone who he will only open up to one person, and that is his priest, right, or something, or something like that. He doesn't talk to priests. He talked to one once. And he admits that one knew what he was talking about, right? All the rest don't. Right. So the sense of superiority over the others who are discussing these things or outgoing about it is something you get with the reserve. They think that they're the only one with this problem, or they're the only one with that wound, and they don't want to show it off to people. And they're kind of ashamed of it, but they acknowledge that it happens, something like that. Yeah, great.
I like. Oh, sorry.
I just want to say.
I like what you said. Oh yeah.
You're talking about each other. I just wanted to also say that this point about going through despair, though, it's also a motif you get from transformation by going to the underworld. Whatever you find it in Jung, you find it in Joseph Campbell and various other places. It's a common part of hero's journey stories, there's something about the psychological reintegration that requires going through the crisis first and not avoiding it. So yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. You have something else?
Very true. I like what you said about earlier about the asking for help, and absolutely the cool way he alludes or foreshadows what he's going to get into in the next part is, I think, with first laying the groundwork for how you must as a self relate to that which established you. And I think that's his way of foreshadowing what he's going to do in the next part is you got to ask for help because you can't do it alone. And this is where you go to whatever your interpretation of what, the formula of God is. So I think that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that even before we get to what help might be, right, there's still something there in the notion that a fully integrated self has to be at peace with itself and in some sense at peace with the universe, right? I think that's something that other religious traditions would agree with as well, right? It's that all the mystics agree on, right? That's not one thing, those are two things. And modern psychology tends to try to make it only about one of them. That's not good enough, right? But anyway, we'll get to more of that in part two, as we said. But other questions or reactions to the discussion? I got Gabriel ready to go and Jim, but I want to give Gabriel a chance first, unless Gabriel.
Okay, yeah, just a reaction, which is sort of just to really emphasize what Ariel was saying, what you were saying, Jason. What I got from this really, what I personally got from this was really the sort of non-individualist aspect of Kierkegaard, because like a lot of people love him for the individualism, but through this you really see, I talked in a previous group, you might remember I was sort of saying that Kierkegaard reminds me of Buber, and reading this I kind of see him setting up the stage for Buber. And I'm looking at a passage right now where it's talking about, my translation calls it enclosing reserve, but that reserved type. And he's talking about, if someone was to say your real secret is that you're proud of yourself, right? And he talks about that. And so it's really that, that inability or that refusal to ask for help, to be humble, to be open to the other, all of that stuff really came through to me. And so, yeah, I find that really interesting, especially how maybe certain other existentialists went with that. I'm thinking primarily of Sartre, who, for me at least, I haven't read much of him, but he strikes me as being more of a, someone that maybe even Kierkegaard would say is in a form of despair, right? He's kind of construct your whole life in a sense, right? More that sort of Stoic thing. And speaking of the Stoic thing, my other observation was, I guess I can't fully go along with your interpretation, Jason. So, when I was reading this, I was really reading it more on a religious level, maybe, than what I hear you doing is maybe giving it a Stoic kind of spin, which is interesting to hear. But I feel like maybe Kierkegaard would be a bit uncomfortable with that. For instance, when you were talking about hope as a practical thing, and you did acknowledge the spiritual level was there, and it is there. But I wonder if Kierkegaard would just say the practical aspect of that is irrelevant. Like, I'm just going to, practical considerations have nothing to do with this. Right. Yeah. Because what he wants to do is he wants to intensify the paradox so much that it's absurd, right? You have no human hope. Yes. But you hope in the divine, right? So that's kind of the sense I'm getting of it. And that's why I was a little bit uncomfortable with that interpretation of, that final form of your life that's going to last in a sense for eternity. Because again, I think that really, that's more of a Stoic conception than it is a Kierkegaardian religious kind of conception, to me at least, which is self is always dynamic.
It might certainly not be the second, but I don't think the Stoics had that notion at all.
Okay, right.
So
I just mean in this. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
So it may be not the conception he has. I mean, I'm seeing elements of that in just the the German idealism tradition he's coming out of, and his formula of spirit that he's getting from people like Fichte and Hegel and so forth. And I can, easily line it up with those things in sort of that interpretation of it, where it would make sense even that way. But I don't think there's anything like that yet in the Stoics. Would the Stoics reject it? I don't, maybe not, but it wasn't a thought that they already had. The other place where I saw something very similar to it, though, recently was in Gilson. It's actually the notion you get in the in the sort of Aquinian Gilson stuff when he finally got to his version of in chapter 6, I believe it was 5 and 6 of Being and Some Philosophers. It was the notion he had of the self formed through the history of the human life. So I'm not looking for that in the Stoa, and I'm not trying to invent it myself as my own contribution to things. I'm seeing it in the German idealists, and I'm seeing it in people like Gilson. But entirely fair that it might not be Kierkegaard's own version of it. You have to judge that for yourself.
Yeah, and it's a fair point you make. I was kind of using Stoic in more of a metaphorical sense, but yeah, in the actual Stoics, that's a different thing. But yeah, those were just my observations.
Yep, good. So Jim, you wanted to go next?
Yeah. Boy, this shows me how much I go down the rabbit hole of possibility. So there was one, but then this is also commenting on something Gabriel had said earlier about Kierkegaard's focus on the religious and theological aspect of the text. It was earlier on where he says, the believer possesses the ever sure antidote to despair, which is possibility. Since for God, everything is possible at every moment. Then he says something interesting about, he said, the bodily or physically, a draught of air is a contradiction, for a current of air is cold. He went through there, but what I thought was, okay, so the draught is the air pocket in the hull of a ship that is just below the water line to make the ship buoyant. Because I go back to 19th century and I think about the different things they might symbolize. So I know this is way out there, but this is more for Gabriel than anybody maybe. I thought this I'm just telling you where my brain went. I said, okay, if he means it by that, then that would mean that the story with Peter in the water. I know, just stay with me for a minute. Peter, Christ is up walking on the water and calls out to Peter. Peter walks onto the water. He takes his eyes off Christ and starts to sink, much the way if a ship thought about the way that it's constructed, and that part of its the way it floats is to be partly submerged. The human doesn't think about how they're breathing; they just breathe. And I thought in the same way, there was a bit of an analogy there from a Christian perspective, that when you take your eyes off Christ, it's essentially using a part of you that's supposed to have complete faith instead of analyzing everything to understand how it works. In much the same way that a ship, if you look at the draught of a ship from a perspective, is the area.
Sorry, you're breaking
anyway.
Breaking up a little bit.
Sorry.
I don't think I followed all that, but
Okay.
I think you did. But the part I'm gonna jump back for a second to what I think Kierkegaard was talking about in that passage. He's mostly just talking about this
okay.
Contradictions don't bother the healthy integrated person, by which he means something like it's normal to breathe contradiction in the same way that it is normal to breathe possibility and to transform and change and all that sort of thing. His example of the not getting cold in the draft, right, is just a matter of personal robustness, something like this. So he's talking about what it means to be a self that is robust enough that the small gusts don't upset it, don't disturb it. And from his point of view, things which others would regard as giant contradictions are to him but small gusts, right? His notion of the self deals with effective impossibility necessarily does so as part of its existence, something like that. And I'm not saying everyone does. And yes, it's this with God all things are possible reliance there that he's talking about. But the point that he's making is to not be destroyed by a contradiction is health. Was the immediate point in the passage, right? To be so imagine that a person had so little capacity for change or transformation that if anything inconsistent with their previous plans ever happened in their lives, they would despair. That's what he's contrasting it to, right? He's contrasting to someone whose life has to go on rails, or they'll freak out, right? Your life isn't going to go on rails. A healthy life can breathe contradiction. It can deal with upset. It can deal with the time when possibility disappears to a point, right? And the faith in the divine there that he's talking about, the faith when possibility seems to be exhausted, is to him an example of that, being able to breathe that. But what's the point there? There's a point there about you cannot and should not expect life to go so logically that it will not have contradictions in it, right? And you need to be enough of a transformation machine that you can overcome that fact. Anyway, that's the way I read that passage. Beyond that, I can't say about your other reading of it, because I don't get it.
It was probably me going down a bigger rabbit hole than I should have. I like we had done exercises where I have to really think what the thinker thought. Yes. In their time, in their way. And I imagine Kierkegaard sitting, looking out a window, and he's viewing the water. So I'm in, totally.
The thing to understand about Kierkegaard, right? When he's talking about getting cold in the drafts and health, right? Is this is a man with tuberculosis who's going to die of a lung infection at the age of 42, right? Who's already lost 8 members of his family, right? So when he's talking about health and a draft, he's not speaking about something abstract, right? Within 6 years of writing this book, he's going to die of pneumonia, right? So, but that's not the kind of sickness he considers unto death, so to speak. But if he wants to reach for a physical analogy of health, respiratory illness is one he's extremely familiar with.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think just for one comment there. No, okay. What I think he was getting at was the like you said, the contradictions are small to him. What the world would would see as big contradictions that would easily sway him. He is not swayed because he is what you said, robust. Yes. And I think what he was getting at with that was piggybacking off of that point and saying he is robust because he is grounded in what grounded him via what established him. Yes. I think that's what you were getting at.
That is where Greg thinks he is. Yes, fair. Okay. Other reactions to the conversation so far before we get into specific questions? Anthony, do you want to go? No? Okay. Craig? No? Okay. Jeff, I can't see your face, so you have to tell me if you want to jump in here, but.
No, I'm just listening. It's been good.
No problem. Okay, so we've covered reactions to the conversation. I'll leave one last chance for specific questions. There was a passage that made no sense to you. What was he talking about here? A highlighted, moment, anything like that. If I can untangle any one of them for you, let me know. Some textual detail
of a passage. I did have a question of a passage, and cool. I believe this is where he was talking about the reserved self and talking about their craving for solitude and how most people don't understand the meaning of what it is to want solitude. And he made a kind of satirical remark of, oh, we're gonna relate solitude and the need for it as a epigram. He said epigram. I don't know what epigram means, but he said it'll be a punishment for criminals to have to be in solitude.
Yeah. Yes. He's one of these people who loves solitude so much and is so relieved by it that the idea that solitary punishment would be a punishment, solitary confinement would be a punishment, is to him laughable. It's like solitary confinement. That's like, cake on Wednesday, right? This is, it sounds like a celebration to him, right? I get to have solitary confinement. Oh my gosh, right? And he's pointing that out as, that's a difference in taste that an inward character kind of has, that he does not consider. He considers solitude as necessary as breathing. It's something he needs for his psychological health, to have some time alone, to have some time to reflect and be alone and just be in the interior of his consciousness and mull over everything. And that he's just saying that people who have had this experience of they despaired once and now they're reserved about it, have that kind of need for an inwardness about them, right? Regardless of where they were temperamentally before, they develop that kind of need for solitude, because putting on a brave face about your despair in front of everyone else is exhausting, right? And if you have to do it all the time, you can't keep it up, right? So the person who is putting on a brave face about not being in despair needs time alone with themselves where there are no defenses up, and they can, think about things, clearly and honestly, and, admit things to themselves, whatever else, right? So there's a sense in which that sort of, there's a need for solitude that grows out of anyone who is reserved about their despair. And Kierkegaard is telling you that very clearly from his own experience. He's in this category, or was for a long time. He may be less reserved about his despair now than he was, for a good chunk of time. But that's the way in which solitude is necessary for someone who is reserved. Good question.
So epigram means
Right,
like, oh goody.
Epigram just means a saying. To put something in an epigram is to come up with a short, witty saying that encapsulates an important thought. Know thyself is an epigram. Everything in measure is an epigram, right? And he was just imagining that in the future we will misunderstand the need for solitude so much that the average person will consider solitary confinement to be a punishment for criminals, because they want to flit around among the social so much that they need people around all the time to help distract them from the otherwise inward thoughts they might have, right? And so so that's the part he's saying. He knows that the person who needs solitude is rarer than the person who needs sociality, but he's saying that the culture around him values sociality so much that they don't understand a need for inwardness at all, right?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So he's sort of mocking that person and saying, oh, I have an idea. How about we just view solitude as something we do to criminals? That's what he's saying. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Yep. Great question. Okay, looking for more hands up. Joe?
I guess the story of Brer Rabbit and the Briar Patch is no longer acceptable, but that's exactly the same example she had. Brer Rabbit wanted to be thrown in that briar patch.
I don't know. Before my time. I followed the Peter in the Red Sea, no, not Red Sea, in the Dead Sea, but one I followed up, but I don't get either. Okay. All right. So next time, that's the next thing we should talk about is 2 weeks sufficient for the next time, or is that going to be a time that's bad for Craig? Right now we're on the 4th. So the last Sunday, which is when, Craig, you have your other group maybe most of you have other group, is the 25th, so 18th would be open.
Yeah, 18 works.
Okay, so it's just Despair is Sin, part 2 for the 18th. Another thing to think about and to bring for next time is suggestions about what you might want to do next, because this will be finishing up this particular work of Kierkegaard. There's lots of other works of Kierkegaard, but there's also lots of other things we talked about. We had talked about going back to the to doing Heidegger and Parmenides as a possibility, but I'm open to many suggestions, both continuing on this stuff or you know, bring for next time your suggestions about the kinds of things you would like to do next. Let's put it that way. All right. So we'll see you then. Thanks, everyone. This is great. Great discussion. All right. Bye-bye.